For thousands of years, the fight for land, territory, and resources has dominated the history books, as well as those commanders who fought them. But one century stands out as the bloodiest, a period full of conflicts, wars, and revolutions. The 20th century. A century which saw momentous military advances in both technology and armaments, in the air, out at sea, and on the field of battle. A century that led to a new generation of leaders, whose ideas, maneuvers, and strategies would earn them their place in history as military masterminds. Napoleon Bonaparte's swift attacks took advantage of a military tactic based on the use of overwhelming power that paralyzes the enemy. A tactic that is still used in modern warfare, known as rapid dominance.
Rapid dominance is a military strategy, otherwise known as shock and awe, and this is where an army will display a huge amount of force to attack an enemy and completely undermine their morale.
Dominance is all about putting that vast amount, that preponderance of force onto the enemy to make sure that you can overwhelm them and compel them to do your will.
And during some of the major conflicts of the 20th century, the world would witness 4 military masterminds using rapid dominance to achieve absolute and stunning victories. Ever since the creation of the Israeli state after the Second World War, tensions between Israel and its Arab neighbors had been tense. The next few decades would see many incursions and battles between these fierce rivals, each backed by one of the superpowers, Israel by the Americans, and countries such as Syria and Egypt supported by the Soviet Union. But in the late 60s, this strain in relationships would all come to a head. On the 13th of May 1967, the Soviets secretly warned the president of Egypt about an imminent Israeli attack on Syria. At that time, Egypt and Syria had an agreement. If Israel attacked Syria, Egypt would come and help. Believing the Soviets, President Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt issued an order.
Gamal Abdel Nasser started moving all his forces, and this was the beginning of the escalation that led to the 1967 war.
It was believed by many that Moscow was instigating a war to increase Arab dependence on Soviet aid. But with the Egyptian army on the move, alarm bells started ringing in Israel, and the government was put on alert. At this time, the distinctive-looking Moshe Dayan was Minister of Defense of Israel. For the Israelis, his trademark eye patch had become a symbol of victory. He realized that his country was at a crossroads. A war with Egypt could also mean a confrontation with its Arab allies. Egyptian President Nasser ordered the blockade of the Straits of Tiran, a strategic position that gave Israel an outlet to the Red Sea, further increasing Israel's and Dayan's fears of an imminent attack.
There is no question that this is not only our right to enjoy freedom of traffic, of navigation to our port in Eilat in Aqaba, but also that it's absolutely impossible for Israel to stay a long time without it.
Tensions had reached boiling point. And on the morning of June 5th, 1967, Moshe Dayan surprised the world by launching a preemptive strike against his adversaries, that would go down in history as the Six-Day War.
Moshe Dayan was born in Palestine when it was still under the Ottoman Empire. Before even the British got to there, he was born in a kibbutz, which is called Degania, and later moved to a place called Nahalal, and he grew up there.
In 1929, at the age of 14, Dayan joined the ranks of a paramilitary group called the Haganah, an underground organization that safeguarded Jewish settlements from Arab attacks. There, he learnt guerrilla warfare, and his clandestine activities in this illegal organization landed him in jail. Apprehended by the British authorities, he remained in prison for 2 years. But during the Second World War, he was released in 1941 to join the Allies in their struggle to defeat Nazi Germany. During this period, at the age of 26, he lost his left eye while looking through binoculars that were struck by a sniper's bullet.
His injury had a long-term impact on him, and he was quite annoyed of the attraction because of the black eye patch.
After the Second World War ended, so too did the British occupation of Palestine, and the country was split to create 2 new states, an Arab state, Palestine, and a Jewish state, Israel. On May the 14th, 1948, Israel gained its independence. The next day, neighboring Arab nations declared war, siding with the Palestinians who claimed their land had been stolen. Israel would have to battle hard for its independence. At the time, Moshe Dayan was commander of the Jerusalem front.
He had quite a lot of operational experience before the State of Israel was actually founded, and had sort of gained a reputation as being a tough and brave fighter. So when the War of Independence came along, he was quite an important figure and was eventually given quite a significant role in battles for Jerusalem. So he made his name during the Wars of Independence.
After a little more than a year of fighting, the Israeli forces prevailed over their opponents. But as well as being a fighter, Dayan was also gaining respect as a man of peace as well.
In the aftermath of the 1948 war, he negotiated with the Jordanians how to partition Jerusalem between Jordan and Israel. And there was Moshe Dayan, the fighter and the diplomat. The mixture between the two will have a long impact on him as he will negotiate in the future as a diplomat.
For the Arabs, defeat at the hands of the fledgling Israeli state was a seismic political moment that would lead to years of more conflict.
In 1953, Moshe Dayan was appointed Chief of Staff Commander of the IDF, of the Israeli Defense Forces. 3 years later, he led the Israeli forces in the Suez War against Egypt.
In 1954, a new Egyptian president came to power, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who began by heightening Arab-Israeli tensions. After he took command of the Suez Canal, once the British had agreed to relinquish its control, war became inevitable.
Egypt had the right to defend herself and defend her territory.
In July 1956, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, nationalized the Suez Canal.
He also decided to close the Straits of Tiran, the body of water linking Israel with the Red Sea, to all Israeli ships.
France, Britain, and Israel got together and decided to go to war against Egypt.
As Israeli Defense Forces Chief of Staff, Moshe Dayan would personally command the Israeli forces in what became known as the Suez Crisis. Moshe Dayan planned and led the invasion of Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, a great success for the Israeli troops who, in just a few days, managed to seize it. But on intervention from a US-sponsored resolution at the United Nations, French, British, and Israeli troops withdrew, and UN peacekeepers were put in their place. Although the war was a military triumph for the coalition, it became a political victory for Egypt, which managed to retain the canal thanks to the diplomatic support of the United States and the Soviet Union. However, in 1967, just 10 years later, the two nations were at the brink of war again, after President Nasser expelled the United Nations emergency force from the Suez Canal.
As the crisis developed with Egypt over the Nasser's expulsion of UN peacekeeping forces, which had been put there after the 1956 war, Prime Minister Levi Eshkol decided the best way to deal with this was to appoint Dayan as defense minister.
Dayan was remembered as the victor of Sinai, a man capable of leading his nation to success. But he knew that he did not have the military power to defeat the forces of Egypt and their allies, Syria, Iraq, and Jordan. His best weapon of defense was to attack. It was necessary to strike the first blow with rapid dominance, and it had to be a resounding one.
The 1967 war, what came to be known as the Six-Day War, surprised everyone, as it came out of the blue.
On the morning of June 5th, 1967, in a sudden and accurate strike, under the command of Dayan, the Israeli Air Force destroyed 90% of the Egyptian aircraft on the ground. A similar airstrike also incapacitated the Syrian Air Force. Nasser's troops were caught by surprise and left vulnerable to ground attack. 14,000 Israeli troops went on to invade and seize the Sinai Peninsula. When, in retaliation, Jordanian planes bombarded the western part of Jerusalem, which had been controlled by Israel since 1948, the Jordanian Air Force was almost entirely destroyed by Israeli attacks. Dayan's troops encircled the eastern, Jordanian-controlled part of Jerusalem, preparing to take over the Old City. In only 6 days, Israel consolidated its overwhelming victory.
The Israeli Defense Forces in 1967 occupied lands and thus changed the face of the Middle East.
Occupying territories in Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, Israel's victory changed the balance of power in the region. Moshe Dayan's leadership, as had been the case in the Suez Crisis, was again key to Israel's dominance. The speed and effectiveness of the surprise attack reinforced his image as a great military strategist. From the moment he began commanding the Israeli forces, he built an aura of invincibility around Israel's army, undeniably making him a military mastermind. But Dayan was not only an icon in times of war. Thanks to his later work in the government of Menachem Begin, his legacy extended to what was unthinkable: peace with Egypt. But it all began in secret.
In many ways, Moshe Dayan is responsible for the peace between Israel and Egypt. Soon after becoming Foreign Minister of Israel in 1977, he traveled to Morocco and met with a representative of the Egyptian government, and they talked about peace between Israel and Egypt.
This would later become the foundation of the peace negotiations at Camp David in the United States, which would eventually lead to peace between Israel and Egypt. Egypt is a strategic nation due to its geographical position. Through the Suez Canal, it connects the Indian Sea with the Mediterranean. Precisely for this reason, decades ago, it was also the target for another military mastermind, the German Marshal Erwin Rommel. Since the early 20th century, the North African country of Libya had been under the control of Italy. In 1940, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini ordered the mobilization of his troops based in Libya through Egypt to seize the Suez Canal, controlled by the British.
So the North Africa front is important, not necessarily from a territorial perspective for the Germans. It influences control of the Mediterranean and supplies to that theatre. It matters because it impacts on British access to the Suez Canal and their then access to the rest of their empire. And it also impacts on British ability to access the oil fields.
The Italian army does not have the necessary equipment and supplies to complete its mission. The British, although outmanned, launch a surprise attack. As the Italian forces retreat in disarray, they are chased back into Libya. Mussolini was desperate and sought help from Germany. Adolf Hitler orders a German special detachment, the Afrika Korps, to travel to Libya to reinforce his Italian allies in February 1941. Commanding the Nazi force was Erwin Rommel, a military man who had distinguished himself for his ability to carry out the Blitzkrieg, or lightning war.
So Blitzkrieg is the technique that the Germans use to launch surprise attacks on their neighbouring countries.
The idea is that you first take out communications with air attacks, and then send in tanks and infantry to mop up resistance.
So you capitalise on the confusion and the breakdown in the infrastructure to sweep in and occupy your territory.
The Blitzkrieg was the hallmark of the Nazi forces, and undoubtedly one of its greatest exponents was Erwin Rommel.
Rommel was born into a middle-class family in Swabia, and his father was a teacher. But he was from quite a aspirational background, and early on he made a career in the army, in the infantry.
Born on November the 15th, 1891, young Rommel enjoyed a happy childhood in southwest Germany.
He enjoys maths, engineering, but academically he's not very strong. So his father actually encourages him to pursue the military career rather than apply for a university. So he graduates from Officer Cadet School in 1911.
He's very much, a man who wants to master his craft, essentially. He thrives in the military setting, and he is very interested in studying it both academically and practically.
4 years after joining the army, he was called up to fight in the First World War.
He first serves in France. He then demonstrates recklessness and the forthrightness that he will become famous for. He is absolutely at the head of all action. He gets injured for this, and then later he'll serve in Romania and in Italy.
His deep understanding of his men, his courage and natural gift of leadership early on indicated promise of a great career. Astute and determined, Captain Rommel earned the recognition of those that served with him. His experiences in World War I were published in 1937.
The book Infantry Attacks is still used and has been used in the 50s, so right after the war, in training military leaders, for example, in American war academies. He was very much recognized for his ability to analyze military situations, sometimes counterfactual kind of interpretations of leadership and leading from the front.
After the German defeat in World War I, Rommel remained part of the now reduced German army and was given a new role. Rommel possessed a pronounced talent for teaching, perhaps inherited from his father and grandfather, and was appointed to posts at various military academies. But everything changed with the rise of Nazism. Hitler's Germany was preparing little by little for a new war. In 1937, now a lieutenant colonel, Rommel temporarily instructed the Hitler Youth. He was then appointed commander of the troops guarding the Führer's headquarters, and it was there where he started to impress Hitler. Rommel's chance to prove himself as a commander came in February 1940, when he assumed command of the 7th Panzer Division, a combined artillery and infantry unit.
Well, Panzer Division is an armoured division, which is a combined arms formation. It's a self-sustaining military unit. You harness the firepower, the armour, the mobility of your tanks, but you also have your artillery and your infantry units attached to it to protect the tanks and then also to be able to hold the territory once you break through.
Despite having never commanded armoured units before, he quickly grasped the tremendous possibilities of their offensive role. His division was called to northern France in May 1940, and with daring and initiative, Rommel decided to carry out a surprise night penetration through the French defensive line. The operation was a success and provided the first proof of his bravery and resourcefulness. He continued to advance rapidly with his 7th Panzer Division.
It becomes known as the Ghost Division because he is able to use a number of tactics to advance incredibly quickly, and he sends a telegram to Hitler saying, "I am on the coast." So we see there this use of mobility and firepower and deception. He manages to sort of advance on Cherbourg so quickly that the garrison surrenders in surprise.
In recognition of his success in France, he is assigned to the Africa Corps to aid the all but defeated Italian army in Libya. Rommel is an aggressive and determined commander. After his arrival in Libya, he quickly moves from defending his positions to taking the offensive.
Within 3 small encounters, it effectively drives the British out of Libya. He then maximizes on this and goes on to pursue the British all the way up to the Egyptian border in a series of absolutely mind-blowing attacks.
The speed of their movements achieved crushing victories over the Allies, forcing the British forces to entrench in Tobruk, a port city on Libya's eastern Mediterranean coast near the Egyptian border. Due to his audacious surprise attacks, Rommel is nicknamed the Desert Fox by both friend and foe.
The man and the myth sort of merge. The Rommel myth is being written to the advantage both of the Germans, who celebrate his victories, but also the British, who use it to excuse their own military failings effectively.
In May 1942, in the defensive line of Gazala, the Desert Fox carries out one of his most celebrated coups. He makes the British believe that his attack will come from one position, while mobilizing another corps of his army across the desert to outflank them from the other side. Rommel's offensive sows chaos, as the surprise attack on the British from different flanks with an unexpected brutal force devastates the Allied units, who were forced to retreat. Rommel continues to advance. Now, his objective is Tobruk, where around 30,000 Allies defend their position. On June 20th, 1942, an intense air and artillery attack on the port city begins. A tank and infantry assault immediately follows.
He manages a surprise attack with 5 full divisions that catches the British completely by surprise, drives through their headquarters, and leaves them absolutely reeling.
The capture of Tobruk was one of the most disastrous episodes for the Allies in the entire Second World War, as tens of thousands of troops were taken prisoner. Hitler, impressed by Rommel's successes, promoted him to Field Marshal. But the scales were about to tip against him. Attempting to take Cairo, Rommel would be defeated by another military mastermind, the famous British general Bernard Montgomery, ending the Field Marshal's African campaign.
In early 1944, Rommel is transferred over to be the General Inspector of the Western Defences, which means that he has to defend, certainly France, from Allied invasion.
But Rommel could see the writing on the wall for Germany, which was beginning to lose the war. He was already expressing his dismay at many aspects of the Nazi campaign.
It was clear to him that the war was lost, but it was also clear that Hitler was unable to accept it and unable to accept the consequences. Hitler was not changing his mind.
On July the 17th, 1944, Rommel's car was attacked by British fighters, and the Marshal was seriously wounded. But as he lay in a hospital bed, it was an event many miles away that would seal his fate. There was a failed assassination attempt to blow up Adolf Hitler in his military bunker, and Rommel was dragged into the conspiracy.
What happens, though, is when the July bomb plot fails, is that his name comes up when the conspirators been interrogated, and therefore he falls under suspicion.
However, Rommel was not aware of the planned assassination. He never accepted the idea of murder for political ends, and, in fact, he had always ignored all execution orders given to him by Hitler. But his name had come up, and now he was considered an enemy of the Führer.
He is visited by 2 generals who give him 3 options. They say he can personally appeal to Hitler, he can face a trial, or he can take the honorable way out and commit suicide.
Rommel, the most prestigious German military officer of World War II, incredibly popular in Germany and highly respected by his enemies, poisoned himself on October the 14th, 1944, with the Reich's guarantee that his family would be kept safe. But his place in history was assured, and this military mastermind's legacy lives on. In the United States, many young men eager to receive first-rate military training learned from Rommel's book, Infantry Attacks, the basics that this genius of warfare left for history. One of those students was Colin Powell. His rise through the ranks, both militarily and politically, made him a force to be reckoned with. Having learned valuable lessons from the prolonged Vietnam War, Powell would change the way in which the United States would engage in conflicts. His first test was in 1989, when Panamanian dictator Manuel Antonio Noriega became wanted by the American justice system.
The Colombian cartels were using Panama as a kind of way station on the way to the United States. And General Manuel Noriega, who became the head of government in Panama, was in league with them. And as a result, Panama became something of a narco state.
Although for a while, Noriega had been an asset for the United States.
He was an informant for the CIA. He was considered an ally, if you will, during the Reagan-Bush era. And then things started changing.
Noriega wielded a huge amount of power over the government, But when it became clear that his candidate was going to lose in the presidential election of 1989, Noriega ordered the cancellation of the whole process. That was the final straw for the Americans.
In 1989, General Colin Powell was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So he was the senior officer in the entire United States military when this happened.
President George H.W. Bush gave Powell an order. An invasion of Panama must bring down Noriega's government. Powell was ready to attack and was confident that his strategy would lead the United States to victory. 5 days later, Operation Just Cause began, marking the beginning of a different way of waging war by the United States.
Move in, get it done, and get out.
Born in Harlem, New York, on April 5, 1937, Colin Powell was the son of Jamaican immigrants. Although classing himself as a C average student and not keen on studying, he had set his sights on college. In 1954, having enrolled to study geology, Powell was impressed by the sight of young men wearing military uniforms in his college. Inspired by this, he simultaneously joined the Reserve Officers Training Corps, a program designed to identify future military leaders.
General Colin Powell, of course, being an African American, he saw challenges along the way, but he's quick to tell you that he never felt it in the military.
Powell later spoke about this experience and described it as one of the happiest of his life. "I not only liked it, but I was pretty good at it," he said. Upon graduation, he received a commission as an Army second lieutenant. After promotion to captain in 1962, Powell received orders that he was being sent to Vietnam. He was one of the advisors sent by the thousands by the Kennedy administration to bolster South Vietnam's army against the Communist North. In the war, Powell wounded his foot and was awarded the Purple Heart. After serving a leave of absence at home, he began his second tour of duty in Vietnam in 1968, receiving a decoration for bravery after rescuing 3 other soldiers from the burning wreckage after a helicopter crash.
His formative experiences were in Vietnam, and I think that shaped his attitudes to how armed force should be used in the future. He had a strong view, I think, that was true of most of those of his generation, that the Vietnam War had been mismanaged and that armed force had not been used properly.
Powell, who also wanted to pursue a civilian career, sought to merge his military vocation with some key positions in the federal government. After obtaining a master's degree at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., Powell gained a prestigious White House fellowship under President Richard Nixon.
By the time he reached the 1980s, he was involved in the White House in political military roles. So I think he brought into those roles the soldiers' appreciation of armed force, but then got a greater understanding of the demands of policymaking.
Around 1983, Powell was promoted to Major General and joined the Pentagon as a senior military assistant. In 1987, Powell was appointed National Security Advisor to President Reagan, and 2 years later, under George H.W. Bush, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was the first African American and youngest person to achieve that position. It was at that time that he drew up what years later would become known as the Powell Doctrine, no doubt inspired by the American failure in Vietnam. According to the Powell Doctrine, Washington should not get involved in conflicts where vital national interest was not at stake. If war was the only option, after exhausting all diplomatic channels, military deployment should be forceful, rapid, and dominant, making defeat practically impossible.
And these essentially emphasized the importance, if you're going to do these things, do it to win, make sure you've got sufficient force, and keep public opinion with you.
Make sure you have a clear political purpose in mind when you decide to use military force, and then use it in a way that will decisively allow you to achieve that political objective.
A great test of the Powell Doctrine was during George H.W. Bush's presidency. When Bush was the director of the CIA, the Panamanian general Manuel Noriega had already been on the CIA's payroll for years. But when Noriega became a problem for the Americans, Bush sought to get rid of him with Operation Just Cause.
So the United States had this very ambiguous relationship with General Noriega. On the one hand, he was a source and had been helpful in the past. But on the other hand, he was now running a government that was assisting in the smuggling of narcotics into the United States, cocaine primarily.
For Powell, the operation was an opportunity to put his military ideas into practice. On December the 20th, 1989, Operation Just Cause began.
I think that's where you see the Powell Doctrine falling back into place, where it was get in there with overwhelming numbers. 27,000 troops responded to Operation Just Cause.
Fighter bombers and helicopters initiated a heavy bombardment of Panamanian political and military installations. In a short time, the U.S. Air Force totally annihilated the Central American Army's response capacity of only 12,000 men. U.S. troops quickly took control of the country, meeting little resistance. Guillermo Andara was sworn in as the new president of Panama, and Noriega sought refuge in the Vatican's embassy in Panama City. On January 3, 1990, Noriega surrendered himself to be brought before U.S. justice. In just a few days of conflict, the United States had achieved its objective, and Operation Just Cause was celebrated in Washington as a total success.
USA! USA!
U.S. troops withdrew completely from Panama in February 1990. Powell's reputation, acquired after the invasion of Panama, would skyrocket in 1991 with the offensive that drove Saddam Hussein's forces out of Kuwait.
We will exploit Iraqi weaknesses with our strengths. They will not be dealing with 15-year-old Iranians being offered up as cannon fodder. They will be dealing with a very powerful, capable force.
Iraq and Saddam Hussein, they rolled into Kuwait and were brutal, quite ruthless as they got into the country. And the President of the United States said, this will not stand. And so Colin Powell, as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he instantly knew what that meant, and he took action.
Powell was a key figure in the major transformations experienced by the U.S. armed forces since the end of the Cold War.
There was no one like General Powell. No one at all. There was no other African-American general that was prominent, period.
But apart from being the first African-American to become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a four-star general, and Secretary of State, his great legacy, the Powell Doctrine, was carried on by several subsequent administrations, both Democrats and Republicans.
Colin Powell was a military mastermind. He understood, he took lessons learned and internalized them in a way that many of us don't. We sort of go through life and we sort of let life go through us, as opposed to him really reflecting.
The Powell Doctrine changed the way the United States waged war, and through it, managed to correct some of the mistakes made by the Americans during the Vietnam War. However, in 2002, after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, the George W. Bush administration withdrew the doctrine in favor of a new national security strategy, attacking, if necessary, any nation where an immediate threat was detected. After the Al-Qaeda attacks on the World Trade Center in New York, the White House decided to respond forcefully. An attack of such significance on US soil had occurred only once before, 6 decades earlier, when the Japanese bombed the US naval base at Pearl Harbor. In 1941, oil shortages endangered Japan's expansionist plans. Great Britain, the Netherlands, and the United States maintain an oil embargo as punishment for the Japanese invasion of China, which began in 1937.
In Japan, there are no natural oil resources, so the Japanese military relied on imports of oil.
While the United States hoped embargoes on oil and other key goods would lead Japan to halt its expansionism, the opposite happened. It stirred up the anger of its people against continued Western interference in Asian affairs. Emperor Hirohito felt that war with the United States had become inevitable. For the commander-in-chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet, Isoroku Yamamoto, a war with the Americans would mean imminent defeat. The only chance of success would be a surprise attack on US bases, an offensive so forceful and swift that it would force the United States to negotiate.
Yamamoto was born to a firmly middle-class family. His father, in fact, was part of the famous samurai class. And Yamamoto was always passionate about military history and a very studious young man.
He was very fastidious at school, sometimes referred to as aggressive, even competitive, but he was loved by everybody. He was an extremely charismatic man, and really charisma and strong decision-making and being very, very assertive are great qualities of leadership, and that definitely could be seen throughout his education.
Yamamoto then enlisted in the Japanese Naval Academy and was immediately plunged into the throes of war, as Japan tried to halt Russian expansionist ambitions in East Asia.
In 1904, just as he graduated, the Russo-Japanese War had broken out, and this was where his naval career really started in earnest. He served on a ship during the war, where he was unfortunately badly injured. One of the guns on the Nishan ship actually exploded. He lost 2 fingers and had terrible, terrible shrapnel injuries, which actually stayed with him for the rest of his life.
Once rehabilitated, Yamamoto's career in the Japanese Navy began to flourish.
He was seen, in a sense, as a rising star from a very young age. Incredibly intelligent, sharp-witted, forward-thinking. He was quite an interesting character.
As a lieutenant commander, Yamamoto was sent to Harvard University in the United States to study English.
He'd spent time in America during his naval career, where he had learned English very, very well and also come to know about American customs.
He also learned to play poker. With cards, he realized the need to know and understand the opponent, to weigh the chances of success and to avoid acting impulsively.
Certainly when it comes to his influences in his military career later in his life, poker and gambling was a key part of that.
Upon his return to Japan, he commanded the aircraft carrier Akagi.
Yamamoto was really a pioneer of the use of aviation in combination with naval craft. He had actually, in fact, given command of the very first Japanese aircraft carrier. He had also spent time in the United States looking at things like naval aviation, and he pioneered a couple of things which really proved to be key when it came to the story of naval aviation during the Second World War.
Yamamoto influenced the development of land-based naval aviation. Demanding greater range for bombers, he insisted in them carrying torpedoes, which would be essential for the destruction of battleships. In September 1940, during the Second World War, representatives of Japan, Italy, and Germany signed the Tripartite Pact. Although the military alliance was largely seen as ineffective, as Germany and Japan had divergent interests, it would seal Japan's fate in the global struggle. By then, it seemed to be only a matter of time before the entry of the United States into the conflict. And time was running out for the Japanese. They needed oil. Yamamoto knew that a prolonged conflict with the United States meant disaster for Japan. Applying rapid dominance, he planned a devastating strike, gambling that the Americans would be demoralized by such a brutal offensive. Yamamoto's target was Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, the main base for the United States Pacific Fleet.
The attack on Pearl Harbor itself was actually quite simple in its strategy. The idea was to actually approach Pearl Harbor to within striking range with a Japanese task force, including aircraft carriers, and when within range, to launch those aircraft directly towards the US Pacific Fleet, which was at that time at anchor in Pearl Harbor, with the primary targets being battleships, cruisers, and also land-based targets.
There were going to be two waves of attacks by the Japanese fleet, and they were going to come as a surprise to the Americans. This was key. If the Americans had intercepted any communications on this, if they had in any way preempted the attack, it was unlikely to succeed.
On December 7th, 1941, at 7:55 a.m. Hawaii time, the first wave of more than 180 Japanese planes began flying over Pearl Harbor. Although the Pacific Fleet's 3 aircraft carriers were out on maneuvers, the presence of all of the fleet's battleships was an opportunity not to be missed.
The first wave of bombers was split into 3 different sections. The first lot of planes came through and took the Americans completely by surprise.
Yamamoto's attack was swift and forceful. Within minutes, much of the American fleet and hundreds of aircraft were damaged or destroyed. Later, a second wave of Japanese planes attacked the Americans, but lacking the surprise factor, several Japanese fighters were shot down by anti-aircraft fire.
They did manage to take out around 18 ships in all. So overall, it was a huge success tactically. The raid went really, really well and certainly stunned the Americans, caused a huge number of casualties, and there were relatively few Japanese casualties in response.
But the result of the assault on Pearl Harbor, partly because of that absence of aircraft carriers and partly because it just didn't achieve the amount of destruction that was desired, was never going to win the war.
Yamamoto was incredibly happy with what happened at Pearl Harbor. It was a great Japanese victory, and he was really on a high, and he was regarded as an incredibly successful leader. What happened after that, however, is slightly different.
Strategically and militarily, the successful attack on Pearl Harbor raised the prestige of Isoroku Yamamoto. But geopolitically, Pearl Harbor didn't achieve the ultimate goal. Despite spending time in the US when studying, Yamamoto didn't know the Americans that well. He thought they would capitulate, but instead, it gave them fuel to fight back. The day after the attack, the United States declared war on Japan, fully entering into World War II and forever changing its course. Nevertheless, Yamamoto continued to have military successes in the Japanese offensive in the Pacific. But the blow Yamamoto had inflicted on the United States would not be forgotten, nor go unpunished. Having received intelligence, the US learned that in mid-April 1943, he would visit military bases in the Solomon Islands and launched Operation Vengeance.
Operation Vengeance was the US plan to assassinate Yamamoto. This came about because the US had managed to crack the Japanese secret code that they were using for their communications, and Yamamoto, in perhaps not his wisest move, had decided to go on a morale-boosting tour of Japanese forward bases in the Far East.
It was just after 9 o'clock in the morning, on April 18, 1943, when the military plane in which Admiral Yamamoto was traveling close to the Solomon Islands was shot down by US fighters.
His remains were recovered, they were taken back to Tokyo, and when they went on parade through Tokyo, more than 1 million people turned out to see them. So that gives you some idea of how Yamamoto was viewed.
Isoroku Yamamoto's daring and great contributions to carrier warfare earned him a place among the military geniuses of the 20th century.
He pioneered the idea of using land-based aircraft armed with torpedoes which could strike at long range against naval craft out to sea. And secondly, he also was a real proponent for the idea of grouping together aircraft carriers so that numerous aircraft could be used en masse against large targets. In fact, exactly what happened at Pearl Harbor.
He is regarded as one of the great military leaders of the 20th century, potentially of all time in Japan, really.
Speed, unpredictability, the use of overwhelming power, mastery of the battlefield, and spectacular displays of force that paralyze the enemy and destroy the will to fight were key to the success of the rapid dominance that these 4 military geniuses implemented in the wars they fought. Dayan, Rommel, Powell, and Yamamoto are 4 great military strategists who earned their place in the annals of warfare. Without a doubt, they can truly be called military masterminds. For thousands of years, the fight for land, territory, and resources has dominated the history books, as well as those commanders who fought them. But one century stands out as the bloodiest, a period full of conflicts, wars, and revolutions. The 20th century. A century which saw momentous military advances in both technology and armaments, in the air, out at sea, and on the field of battle. A century that led to a new generation of leaders, whose ideas, maneuvers, and strategies would earn them their place in history as military masterminds. November 1917. First World War. The British need to take the French city of Cambrai at all costs. And to do so, they are about to change the history of warfare.
The British had developed new strategies, and it was here they started to use infantry alongside artillery and alongside fledgling air power to try and overwhelm and overcome German trenches.
It was the first large-scale effective use of tanks in warfare, and one of the first modern cases of combined arms strategy.
Combined arms operations are where a military will use all assets at its disposal, the army, the air force and navy, in a joint effort to attack an enemy.
However, combining these forces needs incredible planning, decisiveness and authority. The outcome on battlefields across the Second World War's Western and Eastern fronts, the Vietnam War and the Gulf War, would depend on the tactics of 4 military masterminds who combined forces to maximize their combat power and change military history forever. During the early days of the Great War, a young British officer was seriously wounded in northern France. At the time, nobody would have guessed that would signify the start of this soldier's remarkable military career. His name? Bernard Law Montgomery.
Bernard Law Montgomery is perhaps one of the most controversial and complex characters in the Second World War.
The great thing when you go fighting, of course, my business, as you know, is fighting. Fighting the Germans, or anybody else, too, who wants to have a fight.
June 6, 1944, Normandy. A vast Allied armada transports some 156,000 troops who will attempt to land on the beaches of northern France to begin its liberation from the Nazis. D-Day had begun.
By the time we get to the Normandy landings, we can see that the momentum is very much with the Allies. They're the ones who are demonstrating the initiative, but the Germans still have a lot of fight left in them.
Leading the Allied ground forces was General Montgomery.
He has a huge, incalculable sort of contribution to Allied success in the Second World War, but he has an incredibly sort of prickly personality. He falls out with pretty much everybody, including his superiors, particularly the Americans in the Normandy campaign.
He was, by his own admission, a difficult man to get along with, somewhat boastful, and apt to argue, particularly with his superiors. Although that being said, he was beloved by his men.
Montgomery was born in London in 1887. His father was an Anglo-Irish priest, and his mother was the daughter of a preacher.
He's the fourth of 9 children. He's brought up by his mother, and he's very open about this toxic relationship that he has with his mother. She's a violent personality. He goes to St. Paul's, and this is where he begins to develop an interest in the military.
He went into the military at a young age with the aim of being a career soldier. With a lot of travelling in his youth, he really settled down when he eventually joined the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst.
Montgomery graduated in 1908, and in 1914 he was transferred to France to fight in the First World War. But action on the front line was short-lived. He was shot through the lung by a sniper.
Because of the seriousness of his wound, he was eventually repatriated back to the UK.
However, he went on to make a full recovery and saw out the rest of the war as a staff officer, serving in the battles of the Somme and Passchendaele. During the Great War, he observed the tactics of leading generals and became critical of their acceptance of high casualty rates on the battlefields.
Montgomery was also a great student of military history and studied conflicts from around the world. His famous adage was, "If you want peace, understand war." After the First World War, Montgomery rose through the ranks, and by 1938, he had been promoted to Major General.
The following year would see the start of his biggest challenge to date, as World War II was declared.
A period of time went by whereby he was in command of forces in the southeast of England before eventually embarking for Africa.
It was here that Montgomery's military genius began to shine. He took command of the British 8th Army. With his charismatic leadership, he managed to restore the morale of the troops who had suffered humiliating defeats against the Nazis. He ensured his men were properly supplied and trained, and turned them into a winning force. During the 1942 Battle of El Alamein in Egypt, Montgomery achieved a great victory over the German forces led by Nazi commander Erwin Rommel. Much to Churchill's frustration, Montgomery had delayed the attack by 7 weeks until he felt his troops were ready. He prepared a well-organized offensive and managed to outnumber the Axis forces, orchestrating a definitive blow with air superiority and artillery, infantry, and tank attacks that maximized his combat power on the battlefield. Montgomery also deployed air and submarine attacks to disrupt German supply lines of fuel, ammunition, and food across the Mediterranean. When the full attack came, Montgomery managed to defeat the previously unstoppable army commanded by Rommel. Montgomery would then play a crucial role in the invasion of Sicily, which began the liberation of southern Europe. Combining forces with another military mastermind, the American general George Patton, they led the successful Allied offensive on the island and managed to make the German and Italian forces retreat to the continent. Then, the British 8th Army, commanded by Montgomery, continued its offensive into mainland Italy. The victorious Allied continental invasion led to the fall of Benito Mussolini, the head of the Italian fascist state, and the capitulation of Italy on September the 8th, 1943.
After his decisive participation in the Italian campaign, by 1943, Montgomery had become one of the most famous generals of World War II. He was described by Churchill as indomitable in retreat, invincible in advance, insufferable in victory. And his flamboyant personality led to him being affectionately known as Monty.
He knows how to play, certainly, the celebrity game. He dresses in a slightly showman-y way. For example, he'll wear his driving gloves when he's meeting people. He'll wear too many scarves. It's all faintly ridiculous. The fact that we refer to him as Monty rather than Montgomery shows that he really captures the public imagination.
When the war is going to end? When? Well, you can choose your own date and put the money on. I got some money on. I won't tell you my date.
Many Allied commanders thought him to be egocentric, with a swelled sense of self-importance. Indeed, Monty viewed himself as a true military mastermind. He had altercations with Churchill, and most notably with Dwight Eisenhower, the American general who led the Allied forces from D-Day onward. Monty labeled him a desk general and was contemptuous at the prospect of Eisenhower commanding him and the Allies. The pair disagreed about the best strategy to win the war, and harsh discussions ensued. However, regardless of their disagreements, both Churchill and Eisenhower later expressed their deepest respect to Monty's tactics on the battlefield.
General Montgomery, I think we had one of the greatest masters of the art of war which British history claims.
Montgomery would have another chance to prove his battle skill in the same place he almost lost his life during World War I, in northern France.
On the coast of Normandy, his greatest challenge awaited him: commanding all Allied ground forces on D-Day.
It's been said he scribbled out his plans for the largest land, air, and sea operation in military history on a single sheet of paper. At the bottom, it read, "The keynote of everything to be simplicity." But none of it was simple. Supported by thousands of ships and aircraft, Monty's plan involved over 155,000 Allied troops either parachuting into France or storming onto its beaches. In Monty's message to the troops about to go into battle, he told them the time has come to deal the enemy a terrific blow in Western Europe. The blow will be struck by the combined sea, land, and air forces of the Allies.
The D-Day landings themselves were actually incredibly successful. By the end of D-Day, the British troops, along with their American and Canadian counterparts, were firmly ashore in Fortress Europe.
But Monty would still have to face a fierce fight before he could claim victory during the first part of the Normandy campaign. The British and Canadian forces were to control the city of Caen, and then move southwest to protect the eastern flank for the Americans heading for the port of Cherbourg.
Caen had great road, rail, and even canal links, and it acted as a hub which would allow the Brits enough place to form up, expand out their beachheads, and also take the advance to the enemy.
But after a month of failure, Montgomery would again turn to combat power. He ordered the Allied Air Force to bomb the German defenses north of the city, who were then forced to begin a retreat.
He used all the combined arms aspect of his power, and especially air power. He really used air power to interdict the German supply lines.
Han was finally liberated from the Nazis on July 20th, 1944, after a brutal tank attack. Although demoralized, tired after weeks of fighting and losing many comrades, the respect and support the troops had for Monty allowed him to persevere with a decisive attack. Taking advantage of the Germans' retreat towards Falaise, Monty's plan was to try and trap them there.
The tens of thousands of German troops were penned in and almost entirely cut off by two simultaneous thrusts, one by the British and Canadians and one by the Americans, which left only a very narrow corridor for Germans to escape through, with only a couple of fords crossing a river. Whilst penned into this gap, they were relentlessly hammered by Allied air power and artillery.
The Nazis had been defeated in Normandy, and the Allies finally managed to advance towards Paris, which was liberated on the 25th of August, 1944. France is declared free, and the Allies continue their unstoppable advance towards Berlin.
And just under 9 months later, on May the 4th, 1945, in northern Germany, it was Montgomery who accepted the surrender of the Reich.
Monty had earned his place in history.
Like many great military commanders, Montgomery's legacy is perhaps the fact that he was present at the head of a large force in a pivotal period in military history, and he's remembered today as one of the leading generals of the entire Second World War.
His successful strategies against the Nazis in North Africa, his leading role starting the liberation of Europe in Italy, and his bravery and intelligence to defeat the Third Reich in Normandy have put Montgomery on the exclusive list of history's military masterminds. November 1965, Drang Valley, Vietnam. B-52 aircraft bombarded the thick Vietnamese jungle as a swarm of US helicopters transfer 450 troops on a mission to destroy established North Vietnamese bases in the area. It was the first helicopter air assault in history and the first bombing raid carried out by B-52s, an innovative plan ordered by General William Westmoreland.
General William Westmoreland is a really interesting figure who just spans a huge historical transition. In his first job, he's responsible for the stables and taking care of the horses. In his last job, he spends his weekends qualifying as a helicopter pilot.
General Westmoreland was born in the crucible of war. He was born in 1914, and his life is defined by conflict.
He grew up in South Carolina, within a wealthy family who owned banking and textile businesses. Westy, as his friends called him, was class president in his school days. He is remembered as a handsome boy with good manners, excellent grades, and impeccable dress. But he was also seen as a distant and reserved young man. He entered the United States Military Academy at West Point, New York in 1932, where he was made first captain of his class.
So General Westmoreland, who graduates in 1936 from West Point, and the first unit he arrives at is a horse-drawn artillery unit. And he makes a name for himself as a horseman in the U.S. Army.
He serves with great distinction in North Africa. He takes on Rommel. He leads an artillery unit. He then moves through Italy, specifically through Sicily, and serves with incredible distinction. You start to see him rise up through the ranks in the Second World War.
In 1956, when he was 42 years old, Westmoreland was promoted to Major General and became the youngest man in the history of the US Army to hold that rank. Less than a decade later, Westmoreland was appointed Chief of Military Operations of the US forces in Vietnam by President Lyndon Johnson to take charge of a conflict between the Communist government of North Vietnam against South Vietnam and its principal ally, the United States.
It's here that he becomes a household name.
Johnson initially maintained the policy of low US involvement in the Vietnam War. But shortly thereafter, in August 1964, he ordered an increase in US troops and sent Westmoreland to the Asian country, where he was greeted by 16,000 American soldiers as the commander who would bring the North Vietnamese troops to their knees.
LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, the president at the time, he'd taken charge after Kennedy's tragic assassination, and he trusts Westmoreland. He sees his plan for the future.
Johnson gave Westmoreland complete freedom on how to conduct the war in Vietnam. The general believed it would be won quickly if he applied overwhelming combat power.
He felt it's the only way that you could overcome the Viet Cong, because that's the only way you could stop an enemy that was unrelenting. Deal more casualties to them than you have yourself. Put them on the back foot. Force them on the back foot.
To that end, he ordered relentless bombing campaigns in the field and jungle. Operation Rolling Thunder.
Operation Rolling Thunder was a new kind of US air power strategy. The whole idea of rolling thunder is that you start in a low intensity capacity. You start with a smaller amount of sorties, a smaller amount of aircraft, and a smaller amount of bombs. And you try and coerce your enemy to do your will, to capitulate or to negotiate. And then if they don't, you build up, you roll on that thunder. You increase the amount of tonnage until they do your will.
In November 1965, in the Drang Valley, the first major battle was fought between the United States and the North Vietnamese. There, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese People's Army had established military bases to house thousands of soldiers in the middle of the thick jungle, a very difficult obstacle for US artillery. For Westmoreland, it was the perfect opportunity to test new air mobility tactics, using helicopters to move troops.
Helicopters started being armed and used as weapon stations rather than just transports, and this is an evolution that continues to this day.
Westmoreland also used B-52 Stratofortress aircraft as bombers for the first time in history, which until then had only been used to transport military weapons.
The B-52, configured for conventional bombing, could deliver a carpet of bombs that was roughly a mile by a quarter mile long, and we could do this dozens of times every day. That had a devastating effect on North Vietnamese forces.
Westmoreland, after 4 days of fighting, managed to push the North Vietnamese back. He declared a great victory based on the method the Americans established to measure the success of their search and destroy operations: body count.
He places a lot of focus on body count and on death rates. And it's true in a military sense that the U.S. forces are killing many more North Vietnamese and Viet Cong than they are themselves losing, but it's never at a rate that is so high that North Vietnam cannot replace those losses or choose to pause the campaign and continue it later.
After the success of his new air-mobile strategy at the Drang, Westmoreland gained popularity, not just within the ranks, but across the country. Time magazine even named him its 1965 Man of the Year. He had become somewhat of a celebrity, and some of his officers recall how Westmoreland would sign photographs of himself, one after another, as they met with him. Despite his notability, among American soldiers, Westmoreland was known to be dry and aloof. Norman Schwarzkopf, the commander of the coalition forces during the Gulf War, who served in Vietnam under Westmoreland, witnessed the general's somewhat detached personality. Despite his division having taken heavy casualties, Schwarzkopf revealed Westmoreland only asked him how the food had been on the front and if he had received his mail.
While Schwarzkopf and other soldiers viewed him as emotionally removed, Westmoreland's demeanor may reveal a genuine care for his men.
General Westmoreland establishes a reputation with his mostly drafty troops of really caring about his men. So over and over in Westmoreland's history and his speeches, you hear him talking about like simple soldier care, like making sure that the meals and the mail and the medical care is sufficient. He puts great emphasis on getting out and being with soldiers in the front line and having officers get out and lead from the front.
Continuing his strategy, Westmoreland increased the number of US soldiers in Vietnam.
In evaluating the enemy strategy, it is evident to me that he believes our Achilles heel is our resolve.
But the North Vietnamese had learnt their lesson, changed their strategies, avoiding direct combat with the Americans at all costs. It was a severe blow to Westmoreland's strategy, which landed him in the eye of the storm while US victories began to wane and troop casualties increased dramatically. By 1968, the North Vietnamese coordinated a series of attacks on more than 100 cities and outposts in South Vietnam. What became known as the Tet Offensive produced numerous US casualties, raised questions about the ability to succeed in Vietnam, and pushed President Johnson to stop the bombing, reconsider further troop shipments, and withdraw Westmoreland.
He's a military optimist. He's someone that thinks that Vietnam can be won, just so long as the politicians are dedicated to the cause and they support his strategy. But others around in Congress and the rest of the public who are really starting to grow tired of the war in Vietnam, of the body bags coming home, they start to see Westmoreland as a bit of a liability. So the moment that Westmoreland steps too far and starts to request not thousands, but hundreds of thousands of more troops, well, it's at this point that Westmoreland has gone too far.
In 1969, President Richard Nixon, Lyndon Johnson's successor, began a new policy on Vietnam based on negotiations with the communists and the progressive withdrawal of troops that would end in 1975. After his performance in Vietnam, Westmoreland was highly criticized inside and outside the military sphere. Nevertheless, the air mobility tactics implemented by William Westmoreland in Vietnam, using helicopters and B-52s as attack aircraft for the first time, established a concept of warfare that would prevail in the following decades. Just as Vietnam was the war of the helicopters, armored tanks became a fundamental weapon during World War II, and it was a Soviet general who mastered their use. Georgy Zhukov.
He was a thick-set, pugnacious character, very determined and very forceful, and once he had decided to pursue something, he would do so with what often bordered on a degree of obstinacy.
22nd of June, 1941. The Germans launched the largest land operation in history to invade the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa breaks the non-aggression pact that Germany and the Soviet Union had agreed to in 1939.
When Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the Russian armies get pushed back to Leningrad, to Moscow, to Stalingrad, and it looked like literally they could lose everything.
Stalin, overwhelmed by the Nazi advance, calls Georgy Zhukov to defend the main cities.
Georgy Zhukov came from a very humble peasant background from the Kaluga region of Russia.
Zhukov actually only had 3 years of schooling before he was forced to take up work in order to help support the family. He was apprenticed to a relative who ran a furrier business in Moscow, and Zhukov took advantage of his apprenticeship to study the school books of his cousin. So by the time he had finished his apprenticeship, he'd acquired a pretty good grasp of mathematics and basic sciences.
In 1912, Zhukov opened his own fur business, but fate had other plans for him. In 1915, he was drafted into the Imperial Russian Army to fight in the Great War.
By the end of the First World War, he had seen extensive action against German forces and Austro-Hungarian forces all along the Eastern Front.
But it was back in Russia that a young Zhukov would add to his military prowess. In February 1917, Vladimir Lenin's Bolsheviks seized power from the Tsarist regime in a coup d'etat.
As soon as the revolution broke out, though, he turned his back on the Imperial Army and joined the Bolsheviks.
The Russian Revolution ended the imperial rule and set into motion political and social changes that would lead to the formation of the Soviet Union. Zhukov served under the newly formed Red Army as a cavalry commander. Ever the student of military strategy, he was extremely taken with the mobile warfare tactics proposed by a commander in the Red Army, Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky. He was a major proponent of modernization of Soviet armament and put forward an approach in which aviation and tanks would be part of combat alongside infantry and artillery.
Mikhail Tukhachevsky was one of the leading generals of the Russian Civil War. He was intensely interested in all of these new weapons, so he wrote extensively on this.
However, when Tukhachevsky was accused of conspiring against the Soviet Union, he was executed. But his military theories remained influential, especially with Zhukov, who had steadily risen through the ranks of the Red Army. He would put Tukhachevsky's tactics to the test at the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, the decisive confrontation between the Empire of Japan and the Soviet Union in 1939, on the borders of Mongolia and Manchuria, now northeast China.
The Japanese crossed the Khalkhin Gol River at 2 points. Zhukov, meanwhile, was building up a substantial reserve of forces and then launched a counteroffensive in a manner that became almost typical of the way that he would conduct operations in future. He made a very large frontal attack to try to pin the enemy forces down whilst deploying more mobile forces on the flank, which then carried out a big envelopment and encirclement.
But further west, Russians were about to fight for their country's very survival as Hitler began his invasion of the Soviet Union, convinced that the Red Army could be defeated in just 2 or 3 months. Their first target? Leningrad. Zhukov's victory against the Japanese and his unyielding temperament had got the attention of the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, who entrusted him with the defense of Leningrad as the Nazis advanced on the city in 1941.
The Germans had created 2 particular spearheads. One was striking towards Leningrad from the southwest. The other had pushed on towards the northeast, bypassing Leningrad and moving towards Lake Ladoga in order to cut the city off from the Russian interior. And Zhukov ordered counterattacks against both of these.
When Zhukov took command of the defense of Leningrad, the Germans had the city surrounded. He quickly divided Leningrad into 6 defensive sectors, created forts and trenches, distributed anti-tank guns, and ordered ships of the Baltic Fleet to bombard the German positions. Using combined arms strategies,
Zhukov took advantage of the Soviets' combat power and managed to defend the city against the Nazis effectively. After stopping the German advance on Leningrad, Stalin sent Zhukov to command the defense of Moscow in October 1941.
There seemed to be just about enough time before the bad weather came for the Germans to reach and take Moscow. And clearly all the German armor was being concentrated in this central sector, and Stalin summoned the man that he thought had done such a good job in the north in order to defend in the center.
To avoid a possible German pincer attack, Zhukov established 3 lines of defense, the final one surrounding the city itself and forming the Moscow Defense Zone. Anti-tank battalions were trained in Moscow for street fighting. Many Muscovites were enlisted in the anti-aircraft artillery, and hundreds of thousands helped build the city's defenses. A true logistical feat. These tactics helped Zhukov to hold off German attacks on Moscow for almost 2 months. He then ordered a fierce counterattack with support armies that had arrived from Siberia and Mongolia. German forces were unable to contain the onslaught of Zhukov's troops, and by January in 1942, the Nazis had been forced back more than 100 kilometers from the capital. Because of the effectiveness of Zhukov's strategies, the defense of Moscow is considered by many to be his greatest military achievement. But the Nazis were now enclosing on Stalingrad, in the south of Russia.
Zhukov and Vasilevsky, who was chief of the general staff, were tasked with coming up with a plan to counter the German attack at Stalingrad. They came up with the notion of attacking on either flank against the Romanian armies that were shielding the German flanks, which eventually saw the destruction of the German 6th Army at Stalingrad.
Zhukov, having studied the combat prowess of the German army, advanced his troops at night so as not to be seen by the Nazis, and, in a pincer operation, attacked with artillery from the north and from the south to destroy the encirclement. After his victory at Stalingrad, Zhukov became the coordinator of the Soviet forces in the Battle of Kursk in southern Russia, the largest tank engagement in history.
The Battle of Kursk was, I believe, the decisive battle of World War II. Things were teetering up to that point, especially for the Germans.
Between July and August 1943, some 3 million troops, as many as 6,000 tanks, and some 4,000 aircraft clashed at Kursk. Zhukov proposed a defense-focused strategy to trap the Germans and destroy their armored power. His plan was to delay the German offensive, wear it down, and then launch a counterattack. This involved hundreds of thousands of civilians building a series of defensive belts devised by Zhukov, which included minefields, fortifications, artillery firing zones, and anti-tank forts. It was an impossible barrier for the German tanks to completely break through.
Zhukov built this really elaborate defense in depths over scores of kilometers, and when the Germans finally did attack, it was such a bad outcome, and everything worked exactly the way Zhukov wanted to in that case, and it was a resounding victory.
At Kursk, the Germans lost hundreds of tanks and around 200,000 soldiers, greatly diminishing their combat power. The Soviets then began Operation Bagration, the massive counteroffensive to definitively defeat the Nazis on the Eastern Front.
The result was a series of encirclements that unfolded, and in no case did the encircled force survive more than just a few days. They were destroyed very, very rapidly.
Zhukov advanced through northern Poland, entered Germany, and surrounded Berlin from the northeast and east, joining the rest of the Soviet and Polish forces seeking to conquer the German capital. On the night of May 8th, 1945, 4 days after the Germans surrendered to Montgomery in northern Germany, German Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed the final surrender of the Third Reich before Zhukov. The Nazis had been defeated.
I think that Zhukov has to be considered one of the big, great commanders of World War II. I just don't know that any other single commander during World War II was able to accomplish as much under such difficult circumstances as Zhukov was.
In the darkest period of World War II, Zhukov's fortitude and determination led to the triumph over the Nazis and made him a symbol of victory. Nearly 5 decades passed before the world saw a tank deployment of similar magnitude to that of the Battle of Kursk. It was during the Gulf War, as part of Operation Desert Storm. 2nd of August, 1990. Saddam Hussein launches a surprise attack on one of his neighboring countries, and more than 100,000 Iraqi troops invade Kuwait, sparking international condemnation.
Iraq invaded Kuwait. Very quickly, it was a question of what do we do next? And that's the issue of, are they going to roll into Saudi Arabia next? If they do so, they'll take control of a tremendous amount of the world's oil reserves.
Days later, the United States organized a coalition of 35 nations that began to send massive numbers of troops to the Persian Gulf to defend the border between Saudi Arabia and Iraq. It was Operation Desert Shield, commanded by a relatively unknown military general, who would have his date with history in the Gulf War, Norman Schwarzkopf.
Storming Norman Schwarzkopf was a serious man on a serious mission, with a life that was defined by war. His father had fought in both the First and Second World Wars with great distinction, and this had obviously inspired Schwarzkopf. He went on to West Point, he graduated in the top 10% of his class, and he went on to rise up the ranks.
He graduated from the military academy in 1956, and a decade later enlisted to fight in Vietnam.
There was one particular incident where he made his helicopter land to rescue his men from a minefield. The helicopter evacuated some of them to start with. Schwarzkopf stayed on the ground, urging his men not to move. One gets struck by a mine. Schwarzkopf runs over and lays on him to make sure that he doesn't trigger other mines. This is the kind of man that Schwarzkopf was. This is the kind of action that cemented his reputation as a military leader that would risk his life to save his men.
Schwarzkopf's heroic performance in Vietnam earned him several decorations.
He was a young officer in the era of Vietnam, so it's one thing to sit in the classroom at West Point, to understand it from an academic perspective, but to live it, I think, changes how you choose to lead from there forward. And I think that's exactly what happened with Norman Schwarzkopf.
In 1983, Schwarzkopf was the deputy commander of the invasion forces during the intervention in Grenada, an island in the Caribbean Sea, the first US military mobilization since Vietnam. After a communist coup, President Reagan ordered an invasion to protect US citizens and to prevent the island's use as a base for Soviet and Cuban aggression. The mission suffered communication problems between the different US forces. One soldier even had to use a payphone to call US headquarters because American gunfire was endangering its own troops. Nevertheless, the operation was successful, and Schwarzkopf learnt some important lessons, understanding the need for greater cooperation and communication between the different forces involved in a military mobilization. Those lessons would serve him well years later in Kuwait. By January 1991, Schwarzkopf was leading an army of 750,000 troops, including 540,000 Americans and smaller forces from Britain, France, Germany, Japan, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, among other nations. On January 17th, Operation Desert Storm began. Schwarzkopf wanted a quick victory, and to that end, he would apply overwhelming combat power. First with a relentless air bombing campaign, and then with a massive ground offensive.
Norman Schwarzkopf really implemented what we called at the time air-land battle. And that meant that what we did first was we used air power, because it's much more strategic, it's much more sanitary.
The campaign began with bombardments by Tomahawk cruise missiles, fired from ships stationed in the waters of the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf.
They wanted to really degrade Saddam's forces before moving in those ground troops. They sent in precision air power on the first day. They made sure they took out the communications nodes. They famously said that they'd made sure that Saddam and his commanders were both blind and deaf. They deployed this combat power to ensure they couldn't communicate and effect effective strategy.
In response, Saddam Hussein ordered bombing raids on Israel and Saudi Arabia in a desperate attempt to break up the coalition that was crushing Iraqi forces. But the bombing against his forces continued.
With regard to Saddam Hussein saying that he has met the best that the coalition has to offer, I would only say the best is yet to come.
Air power, like the world had never seen before. It was incredibly thunderous, and it lasted a total of 38 days. And that carpet bombing and the airstrikes that we had over that period of time was meant to, as we call it in the military, to soften the enemy, and it absolutely worked.
The table was set to launch the coalition ground offensive, Operation Desert Saber.
At 0400 hours local this morning, coalition forces began a major ground, naval, and air offensive to eject Iraqi forces from Kuwait.
It wasn't just that I was with the tank unit, so we had to know to go fight other tanks. You also had helicopters that were flying, attack helicopters. We had scout helicopters. We also had direct access to the attack aviation, to fighter jets, to bombers, then also to the intelligence arm of things. Then there's also the infantry, and then there's our left and right flank units that are in our zone of attack. All these things have to be synchronized and coordinated so that when we come and we fight the enemy, they get overwhelmed with it.
Schwarzkopf's cunning caught the Iraqis off guard. He launched a massive tank attack along the entire Iraq-Saudi border.
I think Schwarzkopf's best maneuver and the best decision he made in Desert Storm was what they call the big left hook. The unit that I was in was the lead element of that, the 2nd Armored Cav Regiment. We literally led the way up, all the way from the Saudi desert, all the way up left, and then into the north part of Kuwait, into the Republican Guards, which is where they were dug in the northern part of Kuwait. You may even call it a brilliant move because it was unexpected. The way that the forces had been arrayed made Saddam Hussein think that we were going to come straight up the front. And in fact, that's how he had all his defenses laid out. But then just before that, we maneuvered way over to the west and then bypassed all of the front lines that he had to go up around him and hit him into the flank.
In just 4 days, the US ground offensive imposed a ceasefire and ended the war on February 28, 1991. Only 147 US personnel were killed in action.
I'm proud of you, and Godspeed.
Gone were the days of huge losses of life, as had been seen with the more than 50,000 Americans killed in Vietnam. Schwarzkopf's use of combat power was a huge success.
Oh, I don't think it'll heal the scars of Vietnam. Those scars are there. Just like any kind of surgery, when you got the scars, and they're there for life. But it certainly gives me a whole new set of military experiences to look on with a great deal of pride.
Norman Schwarzkopf, not only was he really strong at understanding battlefield tactics, he understood how to pull people together to do it.
Despite his explosive temper, for which he received the nickname Stormin' Norman, from the start of Operation Desert Storm, Schwarzkopf featured in the media frequently and became a celebrity.
Reverting to my old style, I would describe that report as bovine scatology. Okay, better referred to by the troops as BS. I don't know who that guy's source is, but he ought to get a new source because his source is a liar.
After achieving one of the greatest American military victories of the 20th century, Norman Schwarzkopf retired that same year. He was considered a war hero and was awarded the Medal of Honor, one of America's highest decorations, by President George H.W. Bush.
And the reason we have these good news stories at the end of it all is because it's the right person at the right time in history, just the luck of the draw. Who knows what might have happened had somebody else, a lesser person, been in that position.
Montgomery's legendary triumphs in World War II, Westmoreland's novel air strategies in Vietnam, Zhukov's successful defenses against Nazi attack on major Soviet cities, and Norman Schwarzkopf's great victory in the Gulf War are clear examples of how combat power can be used in a variety of ways to break an opponent.
Combat power has changed over time is of course through the development of technology. So all those things continue to change the way combat power is brought to bear, and then everybody has to change on the defensive side and on the offensive side.
Looking beyond this into the future, we now have the advent of unmanned vehicles, and there have already been experiments with fully autonomous unarmed vehicles. So if you like, robot soldiers, either in the air or on the ground. You know that this is something that is going to develop in the years ahead. And one of the things that the 20th century shows is the consequences of all of this technology. These consequences are rarely what the people who invented them thought they would be.
For thousands of years, the fight for land, territory, and resources has dominated the history books, as well as those commanders who fought them. But one century stands out as the bloodiest, a period full of conflicts, wars, and revolutions. The 20th century. A century which saw momentous military advances in both technology and armaments, in the air, out at sea, and on the field of battle. A century that led to a new generation of leaders, whose ideas, maneuvers, and strategies would earn them their place in history as military masterminds. Disinformation, decoys, traps. In war, strategy and tactics can be creative.
Military deception is all about misleading your adversary as to how much you have in terms of power of your forces, what your mission is, what your strengths are, what your strategies are.
Military deception is a strategy where a false plan will deliberately be provided to an enemy via either communications that they are known to have cracked or leaving artifacts deliberately placed as traps to inform of a diversionary plan.
Deception, surprise, these are key elements in success.
But behind every deception, misinformation, and masquerade are the military masterminds, creating, planning, and executing each strategy to defeat an enemy. During the conflicts of the 20th century, 4 of the most important military strategists of those 100 years succeeded in devising plans of deception, which ultimately led them to be victorious over their enemies. Autumn, 1941, World War II. Germany had taken enormous strides towards conquering Europe. Although the winds of war didn't bode well for Britain, Prime Minister Winston Churchill had taken a stand against Hitler.
We shall fight on beaches, landing grounds, in fields, in streets, and on the hills. We shall never surrender.
But to win against unbeatable odds, Winston Churchill knew all too well to achieve victory would mean embracing the art of subterfuge. Churchill was born in Oxfordshire, in England, in 1874, and grew up in the bosom of the British aristocracy.
Churchill's father, Lord Randolph Churchill, who became a politician in the 19th century, was very influential on his upbringing and childhood. And then his mother was an American socialite, but it was very much a sort of marriage of convenience, and they had affairs galore and all sorts of things. And so Churchill actually had a very emotionally abused childhood, I think is the way we look at it now. He was completely neglected by his parents.
Churchill wasn't naturally gifted academically, so his father decided to enroll him in the army. But it took Churchill 3 attempts to pass the entrance examination to get into the Royal Military College. When he eventually succeeded, his writing and reading improved, and he would serve as both a soldier and war correspondent. At the turn of the century, he resigned his commission to enter politics and became a member of Parliament in 1900. He was appointed to various posts in the government and played an important role in developing Britain's tank technology. In 1915, he returned to the army. Now a combatant, he fought on the Western Front during World War I. It was during this time Churchill's attention was drawn to the power of misinformation in the battle for victory. He learnt that during the Sinai and Palestine campaigns of the Great War, a British colonel had devised an audacious plan. It entailed an officer pretending to be wounded and, while escaping from stalking Turkish troops, accidentally dropping his knapsack. In it were letters and money smeared with horse's blood. It also contained false battle plans to make the Turks think that an attack would take place again in Gaza. And there was no attack planned against Beersheba. Falling for the ruse, the Turks strengthened their position in Gaza, which left Beersheba exposed and vulnerable to a successful attack. The Haversack ruse ignited Churchill's great enthusiasm for military subterfuge. Having left the army after the Great War, Churchill returned to politics, and by 1940 had become Prime Minister, replacing Neville Chamberlain.
Some people found him fascinating, passionate, engaging, a real innovator of his time, and a true leader. Others were less complimentary. But the one thing you could guarantee is that if Winston Churchill was in the room, you knew about it.
A year later, having won the Battle of Britain, keeping the Nazis at arm's length across the Channel, Churchill knew he would have to come up with some clever tactics to ultimately defeat them.
Churchill's relationship with covert operations in particular was always an interesting one. He was also personally very interested in deception as a whole.
Churchill sanctioned the creation of the top-secret London Controlling Section.
The London Controlling Section, or the LCS, was an organisation, a secretive organisation that was created in order to manage, orchestrate and implement deception plans worldwide throughout the Second World War.
In 1943, the Allies were planning an invasion of southern Europe from North Africa via the Italian island of Sicily. Churchill knew that the only way of a successful attack was for an operation to disguise where it would take place. Churchill's discreet organization devised a plan to mislead the Italian and German forces in Italy, codenamed Operation Mincemeat.
Operation Mincemeat is a fascinating case study in the history of deception.
They took the body of a homeless person who had tragically died from eating rat poison, and they filled their pockets with intelligence that said that the British and the Allies would invade Europe, liberate Europe through Greece. Now, they took this body and they placed it into the Mediterranean.
The plan was that the body would wash up on the shores of an area of neutral Spain, where the London Controlling Section knew a number of German spies were operating.
In the understanding that, in fact, the information that was sent with that body, it would find its way to Germany and therefore would poison intelligence sources there and mislead the German High Command into believing that rather than invading Sicily, an invasion of Greece and Sardinia was more likely.
Incredibly, Churchill received a telegram: mincemeat swallowed, rod, line and sinker. The Germans had taken the bait.
And therefore, as a result of those, they put their troops in the wrong place, not in Sicily.
The invasion of Sicily began in July 1943. The island was captured, and the shortage of German forces had been a determining factor in this achievement.
Men and equipment made their historic move upon the continent. The British were back, not as commandos, but as an army. They were back to stay. The tide had turned.
But the greatest achievement of Churchill's London Controlling Section was the plan to mislead the German High Command before D-Day.
The D-Day landings in Normandy were, of course, an enormous undertaking. A huge amount of personnel were involved, looking at so many different aspects, all of which needed to combine in a single location on a single day.
Operation Bodyguard took its name from the words of Churchill himself, who, in 1943, declared that, in wartime, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies. Bodyguard comprised several operations in itself. The scale of the campaign was unprecedented.
These were carefully orchestrated to draw the German forces to Calais, away from the Normandy coastline, in an effort to essentially make the landings easier and quicker, with fewer German reinforcements being at that area.
Churchill knew that German spies would be looking out for any clues to decipher what the Allies were planning. The London Controlling Section devised Operation Copperhead, a plan that involved sending a double of General Bernard Montgomery to North Africa to meet with the troops stationed there. It was assumed that the Germans would think an invasion of Northern Europe unlikely without Montgomery spearheading the attack. Again, they were fooled.
June 6, 1944. The Allied invasion fleet gathered off the coast of France. At dawn, troop-laden assault boats moved toward the Normandy beaches. The invasion of Europe was underway.
Churchill hoped to delay the arrival of German reinforcements in Normandy for 2 weeks. No one predicted the plan would be so successful that the German army would hold back for 7 weeks, still believing that there would be a landing farther north in France.
The German army were convinced that the landings were going to take place at Calais, thanks to the misinformation that had been deliberately sowed by Allied forces in radio messages and actually by the French resistance as well.
Churchill's strategic brilliance would play a major role in the eventual defeat of the German forces in just 11 months. Churchill moved seamlessly between military affairs and politics. For many, his sense of timing was key, buying time to develop his army while US reinforcements arrived.
He was the kind of man that would be perfectly suited to leading a nation at a time of war. Perhaps less so, and perhaps by his own admission as well, less interested in peacetime politics. And actually that played out in votes in 1945.
Churchill lost the 1945 election, but would stay in politics and be elected as Prime Minister once again in 1951. However, having suffered from health problems, Churchill resigned 4 years later after a series of strokes. Impetuous soldier, statesman and orator, prolific writer and painter, war correspondent, strategist, fencer and historian, Churchill is undoubtedly one of the most important figures of the 20th century. By the early 1960s, Western Europe and the United States were divided from the East by what Churchill had referred to as an Iron Curtain. The political, military, and ideological barrier erected by the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics after the Second World War. Tensions were at an all-time high in a period known as the Cold War. Despite being kept at arm's length geographically, in 1962, the USA would be caught in a deception by the USSR that would see the communist regime literally knocking on the doors of the White House. Under the noses of their enemy, the Soviet Union had secretly planted missiles on the Caribbean island of Cuba, less than 100 miles from the United States. This provoked what would become known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest the planet has ever come to World War III. And this was all down to a plan devised by the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev was born in 1894 in Kalinovka, Russia, into a peasant family.
At the time of the Communist Revolution in 1917, he was a miner, and he became communist in 1918 and moved to Moscow a decade later and gradually worked his way up through the ranks.
Lazar Kaganovich, a politician who helped Stalin defeat his political opponents, also gave Khrushchev his first significant job in the Communist Party. Soon, the future leader found himself in Stalin's inner circle, something that would be key to his future. When the Soviet leader died in 1953, Khrushchev became one of the most powerful men in the Soviet Union.
By 1958, he's totally established as the premier of the Soviet Union. In terms of Khrushchev's personality, he was robust, durable, wily, not to be underestimated.
He was known to have this very explosive character and also to have this very direct and undiplomatic sort of demeanor and speech.
In a bizarre Cold War moment, angered by a speech that criticized his country's policies, he pounded his shoe on his delegate desk in protest in the middle of a United Nations session.
He was also compulsive, a gambler, a risk-taker. The most striking, famous evidence for that is his secret speech that he gave in 1956, in which he denounced Stalin, and this began the process of de-Stalinization.
As a leader, Khrushchev wanted to end the old ways of communism and sought to coexist peacefully with the West. He was the first Soviet leader to visit the United States in 1959 and met with President Dwight D. Eisenhower. But just months later, relations suffered a major setback when the Soviets shot down a US spy plane.
Secret reconnaissance of Russia by high-flying American U-2 jets ended when one was downed deep in Soviet territory.
Relations between Khrushchev and Eisenhower are very strained during the final months of the Eisenhower presidency.
Khrushchev's hopes of improving relations with the next American president were dashed with the arrival of Kennedy.
Kennedy introduced the biggest peacetime increase in US military spending in history up to that point. Secondly, 3 months later, he tried to overthrow the Cuban leader Fidel Castro at the Bay of Pigs. Thirdly, you have the Berlin crisis of the summer of 1961.
That year, Khrushchev gave Kennedy an ultimatum to withdraw US troops stationed in West Berlin.
But Kennedy makes absolutely clear that he's not going to back down over Berlin.
The source of world trouble and tension is Moscow, not Berlin. And if war begins, it will have begun in Moscow and not Berlin.
Khrushchev then made a shocking decision. On August 13th, Berliners woke up to a fence separating East and West that would soon become the iconic Berlin Wall that stopped the wave of migrants from the communist sector. The United States roundly condemned the action, and relations frayed, but soon Khrushchev had another idea. Lying just 90 miles off the southeastern tip of the United States in Florida is the Caribbean island of Cuba, which for a number of years had been an ally to the USA. But its revolutionary leader, Fidel Castro, was becoming a concern to the White House, who wanted him gone.
The first act Kennedy took almost as president was to authorize the invasion by exiles in the Bay of Pigs in Cuba in April '61.
But the US invasion was a complete fiasco and a foreign policy failure which widened the political division between the two formerly allied countries and pushed Cuba closer to the Soviet Union and its leader, Nikita Khrushchev.
Nikita Khrushchev was strolling along the Black Sea coast with his defense minister, a man called Malinovsky. Malinovsky pointed out that if you just looked across the Black Sea, the United States had missiles in Turkey aimed at the Soviet Union that could strike Soviet cities in 6 or 7 minutes. It seems that this is the moment that Khrushchev came up with the idea of installing nuclear missiles in Cuba.
But because he knew there'd be an American response, he decided to do it by deception.
Khrushchev started planning Operation Anadyr, an ambitious covert operation that would involve more than 80 ships and the secretive movement of over 40,000 troops. The 5 officers leading the mission were told that Cuba was involved, but they knew little of the nature of the task.
In addition, the name itself was a deception, because the name is of a river in northeastern Russia, and so it suggested that the operation was something to do with the North or the Arctic.
Khrushchev knew the key to the success of this operation was down to secrecy. The missiles were loaded onto the ships under tight security to prevent anyone from leaving the area and leaking information about the operation.
This is astonishing. The commanders of the ships heading to Cuba to carry out the secret military deployment didn't even know they were going to Cuba. They were given a sealed envelope with coordinates in the Atlantic Ocean. Once they reached those coordinates, they opened the envelope to see another envelope which told them where the final destination was.
The captains also had to be prepared to destroy all documents and sink the ships if the operation failed. The first missiles arrived in Cuba through the port of Mariel, while Radio Moscow announced that Cuba was receiving tools, wheat, fertilizers, and machinery.
The levels which Khrushchev went to ensure secrecy were absolutely incredible. In fact, by the time the Cuban Missile Crisis started in October '62, there were more than 40,000 Soviet troops in Cuba.
But the bases could not remain hidden for long. On the morning of October 14th, an American U-2 spy plane found something unusual on the Caribbean island. In just 6 minutes, It took almost 1,000 photographs.
Kennedy is lying in bed around 9 o'clock in the morning when his national security advisor, McGeorge Bundy, comes into the bedroom and tells him there are Soviet missiles in Cuba.
Kennedy received the information. He didn't go public with it. He wanted to know how he should respond before he made any announcement. He didn't want to be rushed into a hasty response.
But 6 days on from the discovery, Kennedy addressed the nation.
Neither the United States of America nor the world community of nations can tolerate deliberate deception and offensive threats on the part of any nation.
Kennedy ordered a swift blockade of the island, as it was feared additional missiles and military equipment could be delivered to Cuba. Any Soviet ships would now be faced with the power of the US Navy to make them turn back.
And then everybody sort of held their breath to see what would happen, because if the Soviet ships tried to get through the blockade, you could have a major incident at sea.
Diplomatic negotiations began immediately, while the world trembled at the thought of a nuclear war. As frenzied letters were sent between the country's leaders, the conflict took a terrifying turn when an American plane was shot down over Cuba, killing the pilot. War suddenly appeared imminent. As Kennedy remarked, "We are now in an entirely new ballgame." However, the American president concluded that Khrushchev had not given the order to shoot down the plane, and there was no retaliation. The incident had made both leaders realize the gravity of a situation that had spiraled dangerously out of control. A day later, on October 28th, an agreement was reached, and the world breathed a sigh of relief as the Soviets agreed to dismantle the bases on the island.
Kennedy publicly promises not to invade Cuba, and privately, off the record, lets Khrushchev know he will remove missiles from Turkey.
The result was a great triumph for Khrushchev. Although his missiles were withdrawn from Cuba, the Americans also removed theirs from Turkey.
Khrushchev played an ambivalent role in the Cold War. At one level, he brought about this escalation of the Cuban Missile Crisis. On the other hand, he introduced Soviet audiences to completely new aspects of Western cultural life. So in some ways, Khrushchev was responsible for the greatest level of Americanization, to some extent, of Soviet society, while also bringing to a head the conflict, particularly with the US.
Khrushchev would stay in power for just one more year after the Cuban Missile Crisis, as hardline communists in his party disapproved of his reforms and eventually had him removed. But he had achieved what no other military strategist in history had ever accomplished: bringing a nuclear threat within a few miles of the United States. Long before Khrushchev's presidency, one American general had warned of the danger the Soviets posed to the United States. After the Second World War, he advised not to forget their Russian ally, as one day they might have to fight them in a conflict that would cost 6 million lives. It was General George Patton, a World War II hero. However, one of his greatest victories wasn't down to his tactics or strategy, but down to the mere fact that he was considered by all, including his enemies, to be a military mastermind. By 1943, the Allies had defeated Germany in North Africa, and the Italian dictator Mussolini had fallen. But Germany had plenty of oxygen left. The Allied powers were now planning an operation which would be both dangerous and critical to the state of the war. It was the beginning of the liberation of France, and it could not fail. Again, it was Churchill's London controlling section, that would be tasked with the campaign of deception against the Nazis. In 1944, Operation Fortitude, which consisted of two parts, North and South, was devised. The North, to make the enemy believe an assault on Norway was imminent, and South, a fictitious assault into Nazi-occupied France via Pas-de-Calais, to take focus away from Normandy, the intended target more than 100 miles away. But for the Operation Fortitude South deception plan to succeed, they needed a military mastermind to ensure its success. American commander George Patton would play an essential role. Patton was born on November the 11th, 1885, in San Gabriel, California, into a wealthy military family. In 1903, he entered the Virginia Military Institute, like his father and grandfather, and in 1909, he graduated from the prestigious Military Academy of West Point.
Patton was never a hugely academic young man. What he lacked, though, in academic ability, he made up for in passion, determination, and drive. And his entry into West Point was really a formative part in his life, albeit having to actually stay back for an extra year due to failing mathematics.
We know without a doubt that Patton was intelligent. He was actually dyslexic. I'm sure this was embarrassing to him, but he persevered because he wanted to be a soldier above all else.
A believer in telepathy and reincarnation, Patton was convinced he had lived many lives, always as a soldier.
He, as we say, didn't lack self-confidence. He was a cavalryman as the branch he served in early in his career. And that was the thrusting, dashing cavalier branch of the armed services. And that melded into the concept of tank warfare. And Patton, in fact, commanded the very first American major armored units in World War I.
Less than a month before the war ended, Patton was badly injured by a machine gun bullet. He lay wounded for hours before it was safe to evacuate him, but he refused to be taken to the hospital until he had reported to his commander. After recovering from his injuries, he remained in the army, and during World War II continued with his use of tank combat. He was also tasked with training American soldiers ready for war, and was famous for his blood and guts speeches.
Then we passed over a lot of ocean. Unfortunately, there were no Germans to kill in the ocean, so we couldn't tell what it would look like when the Navy wakes on it. But we know from experience that when the Navy wakes on things, the things are damn well waked over.
He sought to present an image of himself as a striking leader, which demanded the attention of his troops. Patton had become known for his tough and strict personality. However, his brash actions and unpredictable changes of temper led to numerous controversies during his career.
On a number of occasions in Sicily in 1943, he was actually disciplined for slapping a couple of men whilst visiting military hospitals. Those men had been suffering from battle fatigue, and Patton felt that there was nothing wrong with them. But albeit Patton was a highly controversial character, he was still highly regarded by his men, and they fully respected him for his straightforward way of talking.
When preparations for the Normandy invasion finally began, Patton was tasked with Operation Fortitude South.
Fortitude South was designed to convince the German defenders that, in fact, the main thrust of the Allied invasion was to take place in the Nord-Pas-de-Calais, the shortest route across the English Channel.
Fortitude South was facilitated by a number of things the British had done. First of all, they had gained control of all the German agents that Germany had attempted to infiltrate into Great Britain, and could use them to send back false information to Germany.
To send a message to enemy intelligence, they publicly assigned Patton to command the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, a very special military force. Patton was both feared and respected most by the German High Command, and therefore he would most likely be put in charge of an invasion force. But Patton's role within the invasion was all part of the mammoth deception plan.
It was a phantom or a ghost army. They were created by using things like inflatable tanks, fake landing craft, vehicles which didn't have engines in, didn't run anywhere, communications which were created and put out onto the airwaves for the Germans to pick up, which in fact were only going between operator to operator and had no real military purpose other than deception.
To further cement the ruse, Patton was photographed touring these fake Fusag camps, and the Allies made sure those pictures would eventually be shown to the Germans.
If the point of military deception is to deceive your enemy into the location, the size, and the intent of your military force, then Operation Fortitude South is a textbook example of this.
As D-Day began, the Fusag went into action, and the mirage was like something out of a film. Contingents of harmless dummies landed east and west of Normandy by parachute to simulate an invasion. There was actual bombing in the areas around Calais to further convince the Reich that this was the real objective of the landing. Allied aircraft also bombed areas with aluminium strips to make it appear to German radar that a large air force was in operation over the area.
The success of Operation Fortitude South can be measured not in what the Germans did, but in fact what they didn't do. In the lead up to the Normandy invasion, they'd stationed a number of units around the Pas-de-Calais, including some pretty impressive and well-armed panzer divisions.
Hitler's forces were genuinely confused. Meanwhile, the largest maritime attack in history was headed for Normandy.
The Germans continued to believe, even after Normandy, that Normandy was probably a fake. But absolutely the linchpin of Fortitude South was George S. Patton.
Although commanding a phantom army was not his greatest show of skill, his mere presence saved many lives and gave the Allies a foothold in Europe. Once Patton returned to his actual units in August 1944, his legend as a masterful tactician started to push back the Germans.
After 1 month of fighting, Patton had liberated 873 French towns and 1,600 square miles.
The Third Army, under his command, had killed or wounded more than 85,000 enemy soldiers and taken another 30,000 as prisoners. That incredibly swift and surprising sweep, in only 1 month of fighting, was indeed the most spectacular moment of his military career. But it would not have been possible without the success of Operation Fortitude South. Patton's tactics showed a wise, analytical, and creative military mind. But they were also based on an aggressive strategy. Retreat, for Patton, was never an option.
The great honor you have done me belongs to those men whom I now salute. The veterans of the Third Army.
In December 1945, Patton left for a hunting trip in Germany. In a tragic twist of fate, the limousine he was in drove into an army truck, and he eventually died from his injuries. Although historians generally agree that Patton was one of the greatest military leaders that the United States has ever seen, he is also one of the most complex and contradictory.
He was a forward-thinking, direct, straightforward guy who was beloved by his troops, controversial always, a polarizing figure, but no doubt a single-minded, determined officer who was always keen to lead from the front, to lead by example, and always get the job done.
Three years after the Second World War, the United Nations voted to partition Palestine, to create the State of Israel in an attempt to put an end to the ongoing clashes between Jews and Palestinians. But this only fueled the fury of Palestinians, who felt their land had been stolen from them. Tensions escalated as other Arab nations became involved in the throes of the conflict. After multiple clashes between Israel and its Arab neighbors in 1967, the Israelis launched a preemptive strike against Jordan, Syria, and Egypt, as they feared a buildup of forces surrounding the state.
The 1967 war, what came to be known as the Six-Day War, surprised everyone, as it came out of the blue.
This resulted in Israel occupying part of the Golan Heights in Syria, and the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt, establishing a chain of fortifications along the Suez Canal called the Bar-Lev Line, which was considered impregnable. After the defeat, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser launched a war of attrition against Israel that remained until 1970. That year, Nasser died, and a key figure for the Egyptian military future, Vice President Mohammed Anwar Sadat, took over. He would lead Egypt into further confrontations against Israel, but would also become the first Arab leader to try to broker a peace deal with the Jewish state. Sadat was born on December 25, 1918, in the Sultanate of Egypt, and grew up in a Muslim family as one of 13 siblings.
Anwar Sadat came from a humble background, from a small village. Nobody expected a lot from Anwar Sadat. He went to school, he did have some military education, and in 1952, he joined a group of officers. The leading character in the three officers was someone by the name of Gamal Abdel Nasser, who will become the president of Egypt.
Nasser was incredibly ambitious, and Sadat followed his influence closely. In 1952, as part of the Free Officers Movement, both men took part in a successful coup d'etat against the ruler of Egypt, King Farouk, and the Republic of Egypt was established that same year. Sadat assumed various political roles within the new government that allowed him to climb the ranks swiftly. He became vice president in 1964 and was later re-elected in 1969.
And this is the main reason why Sadat, when Nasser died in September 1970, became the president of Egypt.
In his new position, Sadat faced great economic difficulties. The Arab-Israeli conflict was bleeding the nation dangerously dry.
Anwar Sadat is a fascinating military figure and a political figure. He knew how to meld and mold warfare to achieve political ends.
In 1971, Anwar Sadat said, "This is the year of decision. New Israel must get out of our land." Israel, led by Prime Minister Golda Meir, refused to do that, leaving Sadat with no other option but to go to war.
He devised a plan of deception. He clubbed together a military coalition between Syria and Egypt.
But Israel was very strong, and it was necessary to find a way to deceive them so that the Israelis will not be prepared when the Egyptian and the Syrian attack comes.
The attack, aiming to recover the territories lost during the Six-Day War in 1967, would take place on the holiest day for the Hebrews, hence the name of the conflict that was about to begin, the Yom Kippur War.
On Yom Kippur, the radio is off, television is off, everything is off. The people are in synagogues. What Sadat wanted is a situation where, when he does attack on the 6th of October, 1973, the Israelis will not be prepared.
The necessary numerical superiority of the Arab forces would only be possible as long as Israel did not mobilize its reserves. A quick offensive was extremely important so that the Israelis would have no time to react. Sadat's goal was to strike such a decisive blow that Israel would be forced to withdraw from the occupied territories.
To deceive the Israelis before the 1973 war, before the actual attack, and part of the Egyptian Badr plan was to move the forces in the direction of Israel and back.
In all, the Egyptian army did this 22 times before the actual attack. The Israelis were successfully misled. Before the offensive, Israeli intelligence had also detected Syrian forces on the border, but put the movement down to defense exercises. At 2 p.m. on October the 6th, 1973, Sadat ordered for the attack to begin. The Egyptian army fired towards the east bank of the Suez Canal while its air force bombed Israeli bases on the peninsula. Simultaneously, the Syrians attacked the Golan Heights with its air force and artillery. Their mechanized and armored units attacked by land. To cross the Suez Canal, Egyptian infantry fired smoke bombs to cover their advance and managed to get tens of thousands of soldiers across in rubber boats. Israeli military had previously calculated that it would take the Arabs at least 24 hours to cross the canal. But they had underestimated Sadat's meticulous planning. Within a few hours, the Egyptians, as well as their troops, had around 800 armored vehicles on the other side. With high-pressure water pumps, they had destroyed the sandbanks that Israel had built along the bank, cutting through the supposedly impassable Israeli Bar-Lev defense line. But here, Sadat ordered his troops not to continue any further.
He had no intention whatsoever to destroy Israel. He knew it was impossible. The only thing Sadat wanted to do, he wanted his forces to cross the Suez Canal and to stop. 10, 15 kilometers into the desert.
Sadat's sudden stop hinted at a bigger plan. The intensity of the battles began to exhaust Israel's reserve stock of munitions, and they therefore turned to the USA for aid. The Soviet Union subsequently commenced supplying weapons to the Egyptians and Syrians.
This was the plan. Sadat wanted to create a diplomatic crisis.
The war had now drawn both superpowers into indirect confrontation.
What Sadat wanted to do was to have a crisis, a big attack on the Israelis, which will force the superpowers, Washington and Moscow, to sit together and to start a peace process. He wanted to give the Israelis a bloody nose to surprise them.
The United Nations called for a ceasefire, and with international pressure, the war finally ceased on the 26th of October. The success of the war was undeniable for Sadat, who would write that this contest exploded forever the myth of an invincible Israel.
There were negotiations after the war, and in 1974 and 1975, in what came to be known as the Sinai I and Sinai II agreements, the Israelis started to withdraw from the Sinai.
In 1977, Sadat reinitiated peace efforts and was the first president of the Arab world to visit Jerusalem. The following year, a pair of preliminary agreements called the Camp David Accords were reached with the Israelis, and Sadat received the Nobel Peace Prize for the initiatives. They resulted in a peace treaty that ended 3 decades of hostilities and made Egypt the first country in the Arab world to make a lasting peace with Israel. Sadat, however, did not live for much longer.
In the Middle East, it is not a good idea to be a peacemaker, because there is a good chance that you will be assassinated. And for that, Sadat paid a heavy price. On the 6th of October 1981, in a parade to commemorate the 1973 war, Sadat was assassinated by elements of the Muslim Brotherhood, an opposition force in Egypt.
It's a tremendous loss. I found him such a unique head of state. He took decisions that other people have been afraid to take. If he felt something had to be done, he said, right, I'll do it.
For his detractors, Sadat was a traitor to the Arab cause. But for the rest, he was the hero of the crossing, a name he earned after his successful attack on the Suez Canal. A brilliant statesman who ensured peace after an unavoidable war.
The Middle East was in shock when Anwar Sadat was assassinated. And there was shock in the Arab world, in Egypt and in Israel proper. And a great fear that after this assassination, the peace process will stop. That peace will be buried with Sadat himself.
Churchill, Khrushchev, Patton, and Sadat. 4 ingenious strategists who knew how to use cunning as well as force. But any deception technique that is used too frequently will lose effectiveness, and thus new ones are being devised constantly.
Deception as a military strategy has very much changed as technology has changed in our society. We've all heard of fake news. This can be propaganda that goes on Twitter, on news websites. Fake stories can be deliberately leaked to the media. And oftentimes, if these things aren't fact-checked by proper news organisations, they can take root.
The reach of the internet and influence social networks have over public opinion are immensely powerful. Geolocation and the great advances in fields such as artificial intelligence and nanotechnology are opening up a whole new universe of possibilities for the evolution of military deception, which will become increasingly sophisticated in terms of diversity, ingenuity, and effectiveness.
You've got to think that when it comes to trying to launch effective military deception, you have to have control over a monopoly over the information you supply to your enemy. But with new technologies like the internet leading to everyone having access to open source intelligence, from war being televised through social media into our homes, you start to see how a nation state can perhaps distort the narrative.
What will military deceptions look like in the future? Only after they are executed will we ever know.
For thousands of years, the fight for land, territory, and resources has dominated the history books, as well as those commanders who fought them. But one century stands out as the bloodiest, a period full of conflicts, wars, and revolutions. The 20th century. A century which saw momentous military advances in both technology and armaments, in the air, out at sea, and on the field of battle. A century that led to a new generation of leaders, whose ideas, maneuvers, and strategies would earn them their place in history as military masterminds. To surprise the enemy, to attack and disappear without a trace, to harass, sabotage, ambush. Guerrilla warfare is a unique type of confrontation. Guerrilla comes from the Spanish for small war and highlights the David and Goliath conflict between opposing sides.
Guerrilla warfare is where conflict takes place by an army who is fighting in dispersed, hidden operations, or even by civilian groups who have armed themselves to fight against an enemy.
In guerrilla warfare, the objective is to weaken the opponent through sustained attack or pressure until they are defeated.
Guerrilla warfare will try to use more devious, hit-and-run, ambushing techniques to throw a larger enemy or a better equipped enemy off guard.
Throughout the 20th century, the majority of guerrilla warfare centered around the confrontation between right and left ideologies as communists tried to overthrow capitalists.
Guerrilla warfare is linked to communism because guerrilla warfare is the fight of the weak against the strong.
4 great communist leaders made guerrilla warfare a systematic and effective form of struggle, becoming symbols of success. All 4 earned their place among the great military masterminds of history. In October 1911, a military coup by the Chinese Nationalist Party called the Kuomintang, or KMT, establishes the Republic of China and overthrows the Qing dynasty that had ruled China for more than 200 years.
China, prior to its establishment of the Republic of China, is incredibly rural. I mean, there are obviously growing urban areas, but its industrialization has not reached any kind of significant maturity. It's very much still a rural population. Its bulk of its population is still peasantry.
But the lives of the Chinese people don't improve under the KMT. The country is in turmoil, beset by rampant poverty and inequality. Warlords start to rule in different regions. Wealth belongs only to a few. A large part of the population are going hungry, and the peasantry believe they have been forgotten by the Republic. In 1921, having seen the success of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, was formed and began organizing labor unions in the cities. Although initially welcomed into the fold by the nationalist government, eventually they turned against the communists, and the CCP was driven underground. However, there was one man who emerged from the ranks of the CCP to change the face of his country forever. His thinking would influence millions of people around the world and turn guerrilla warfare into an ideological weapon of proven success. Mao Zedong. Mao was born in the south-central Chinese province of Hunan on December 26, 1893. Despite being the son of peasants, he went to school where he loved learning about the great warrior emperors of the Chinese past, but also Napoleon I and George Washington. However, at the age of 13, he was forced to finish his studies to work on his family's farm. As soon as he could, with the thirst for knowledge that would characterize him for the rest of his life,
Mao traveled to Beijing and worked as an assistant librarian. Inspired by the work of the German philosopher Karl Marx and the Russian visionary Vladimir Lenin, Mao became one of the founders of the Chinese Communist Party. In the early 1920s, nationalists and communists coexisted peacefully, but that all changed once a new Chinese leader came to power, Chiang Kai-shek, who set about radicalizing the Kuomintang government. Kai-shek was a deeply conservative nationalist who fiercely opposed communist ideals.
Chiang Kai-shek rules very autocratically, but what that really does is it makes it fertile ground for any kind of revolution.
The CCP assumed a staunch opposition against the government. Chiang Kai-shek was determined to put an end to the threat, and in 1927, the Chinese Civil War exploded. Outgunned, the Communists' Red Army were forced to retreat to the countryside to continue the fight.
In the late 20s, you start to see the creation of these base areas. And the idea being that through guerrilla warfare, you slowly build up these geographic areas of rural support that give you people, that give you material, and give you a place to sort of incubate your forces and make them stronger. So eventually you can use them to take cities later. And Mao was very big on this, this approach.
Chiang Kai-shek launched a fierce offensive against the communist settlements. But Mao's tactics managed to keep them at bay.
Mao's sort of defensively oriented tactics of like, let the enemy come into the area and then ambush them, or bite-sized pieces of the KMT through sort of mobile, regular operations, is very effective. But others in the party disagree with him. They say, look, this is too damaging to the rural populations. We need to go on the offensive to kind of burnish our reputation, and those fail.
Having ignored Mao's strategy, the communists were now exposed. The nationalists then launched their fifth encirclement campaign. By October 1934, the communists were in disarray and forced to retreat from their settlements in southern and central China, trekking more than 10,000 kilometers to north-central China. This became known as the Long March. The grueling journey took them more than a year. Besieged by enemy attacks, they crossed rivers, swampy grassland, and steep mountain roads.
The strategy was, we win by not losing, right? The Red Army cannot be defeated unless it is completely annihilated, and it's just about getting them up into north-central China, a bit away from the main power bases of the KMT, and ultimately they get to Shanxi province, and that's where Mao kind of sets up shop.
Of the more than 86,000 who began the journey, only about 20,000 survived. But the Long March enabled the CCP to spread the seed of communism wherever they passed. But what happened next would change the course of Mao's life significantly. In 1937, Japan invaded China, initiating the Second Sino-Japanese War. Although fierce opponents, the nationalists and communists put their differences aside and formed the United Front. While the Kuomintang army, larger and better armed, directly confronted the Japanese, behind enemy lines, the communists carried out guerrilla operations to weaken them. With this strategy, Mao was also looking to preserve the communist strength, as he had another objective in mind.
Let the nationalists fight it out with the Japanese. Let the nationalists lose men and equipment and get eroded by that fight, so that way when the war is over and Japan has been expelled and the Civil War gets back on, the CCP is in a better position to win the Civil War.
From 1941, the Japanese withdrew a large number of troops from China to confront the Americans in the Pacific War. This strengthened the position of the United Front, and above all, it favored the communists.
Between 1940 and 45, they've had a lot of time to slowly rebuild their bases of support in the countryside in North China.
In August 1945, after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japanese Empire surrendered to the Allies, ending World War II. Soon after, in September, Japan also announced its surrender to China, ending the Sino-Japanese War.
Now in China, you have a void that both the Chinese nationalists and the Chinese communists hope to fill.
The Civil War resumed. Chiang Kai-shek launched an offensive against his old foe, and Mao responded with his much stronger People's Liberation Army, the PLA. For the next few years, the communists took control of many parts of China, including Manchuria, Nanjing, Shanghai, and Canton.
The nationalist losses are significant enough where they never really recover. And after that moment, momentum is on the communist side, and they are able to use their bigger numbers and their reinvigorated strength and just slowly and steadily eliminate the rest of the areas of KMT resistance until the KMT flees to Taiwan.
In Beijing on October 1st, 1949, Mao proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China. Mao had changed the destiny of his country, which led to him being named the Great Helmsman. His brilliant strategy against the nationalists, his intelligence in confronting the Japanese, and his intuition of waiting for the right moment to launch the final offensive that would end up expelling the KMT from China have kept his legacy alive long after his death on September 9th, 1976.
Mao is arguably that real visionary who takes both Marxist philosophy, Leninist revolutionary philosophy, and then understands the Chinese context. He's the one who really does apply them to a peasantry. And it's Mao who says, I can still show them that their oppression really is not a natural order, but it is something that can be fought against and can even be revolutionized, and you can succeed against that millennia of oppression.
The way that he connected the military aspects of all this to the sort of political revolutionary aspects of it was very unique. This blending of the political and revolutionary objectives with the military objectives is very important.
Mao has made a considerable contribution to guerrilla warfare globally. You can see Maoist groups in places like Afghanistan. They're still active in countries like India. Mao is still this uniting figure around the world.
Mao turned guerrilla warfare into an ideological tool. His theoretical and practical contributions to this type of tactic undoubtedly place him among the great military masterminds of the 20th century. On March the 10th, 1952, on the Caribbean island of Cuba, the population awake to the news that Fulgencio Batista, a former president and a candidate with little hope of victory in an upcoming presidential election, has taken over the government by force. He quickly establishes a military dictatorship.
He abolished political parties, he abolished the Constitution of 1940, and he threw his opponents in jail. Estimates are that as many as 20,000 people were killed by Batista's police and security forces.
Steadily, an uprising begins, with citizens resorting to arms. By the following year, resistance has gained momentum, and with approximately 150 fighters, a plan is hatched by their leader, Fidel Castro. His plan? To take the main provincial garrison of Batista's armed forces, the Moncada barracks. assume control of the adjacent Palace of Justice, and call for a massive revolt in the country. But outnumbered and facing superior firepower, the rebels stood no chance.
Almost everyone was either killed or captured. Some were killed after they were captured, and the rest were put on trial.
However, the assault on the Moncada barracks would be the seed of the armed struggle in Cuba. And although Fidel Castro landed in jail, almost 6 years later, he would become the leader of Cuba. Son of a Spanish landowner, Fidel Castro Ruz was born in the small village of Biran, located in the south of Cuba, on August 13th, 1926.
Fidel was born out of wedlock. His mother was a maid, and his father didn't marry her, and so had several children out of wedlock, and I think that played some degree of impact on sort of his growing up and this sort of impact on him psychologically.
Fidel Castro grew up in a lower middle class rural area. He saw firsthand the poverty of the rural areas in Cuba. He was smart. He went to Catholic high school and then on to the University of Havana, where he was a law student.
Passionate about politics throughout his time as a student, Fidel received his doctorate in law from the University of Havana in 1950, and thereafter became committed to pursuing his political ambitions.
Fidel became involved in the revolution as a result of Batista taking power and disrupting Fidel's run for Congress.
After the defeat of the Moncada barracks in 1953, Castro and his brother Raul were sentenced to prison.
But in 1955, Batista released a lot of political prisoners in an amnesty. And Fidel and Raul went to Mexico to organize a guerrilla army. That's where they met Che Guevara.
Che Guevara was an Argentinian theoretician and tactician of guerrilla warfare, whose ideal was to bring about socialism by means of a worldwide revolution. In honor of the anniversary of the attempted assault on the Moncada barracks, Castro founded the 26th of July movement in Mexico, which attracted many supporters, including Che Guevara.
Fidel was just very passionate. He loved to fight. At the same time, he was quite ruthless, and he realized the importance of violence as a means of achieving, a particular outcome.
In the early morning of November the 25th, 1956, 82 revolutionaries set sail for Cuba to instigate the fight against the Batista regime. A week later, they landed on the southern coast of Cuba. But yet again, Castro would find himself outgunned, and after a confrontation with Batista's forces, only 12 men managed to escape into the Sierra Maestra mountain range, including Fidel himself, his brother Raul, and Guevara. Castro, with so few men, had little choice but to start a guerrilla campaign against Batista in the hope that others would join him.
It was his strategy to divide up the guerrilla army when it became stronger and deploy some columns to other parts of the country to spread the insurrection across the island. It was his strategy to time the descent from the mountains into the plains to really engage Batista's army in what at the end was more of a conventional kind of conflict, with guerrilla units directly engaging with Batista's army, and Batista's army generally melting away in the face of the guerrilla advance.
He was incredibly agile, he learned very quickly, and I think he played an important role in the evolution of military strategy, particularly the embracing of guerrilla warfare tactics.
From the Sierra Maestra, the revolutionaries started their guerrilla strategy and were able to recruit many more to the fight.
And that's where Fidel Castro was able, over the course of 2 years, to build a force from just around a dozen to nearly 10,000.
They attacked the outposts of Batista's army and captured weapons, captured some of the soldiers. Then gradually as they grew, they began to branch out and attack Batista's military patrols.
There's no doubt that the ability to have decisive victories against a conventional military force was amazing, not just for the morale of the fighters, but also for the war that was being waged in sort of the public domain.
Castro would also lead by example.
So he was the one that set strategy. He was out there at the head of the column fighting as well, but his most important role was the strategic one, what to do in what circumstance, what positions to take, what positions to retreat from, when to send other columns to other parts of the country, when to come down out of the mountains.
After 2 years of fighting, the Batista government began a major offensive against the revolutionaries in May 1958. But Castro, now a master in guerrilla warfare, and with many more rebels supporting the cause, managed to put up an impressive resistance.
The guerrillas were able to attack Batista's units one by one, and the defeat of that summer offensive really is the beginning of the end for the Batista regime, because at that point his army begins to crumble. The guerrillas come down out of the mountains and begin to attack towns and cities.
In December, Castro decided to begin the final offensive to overthrow the dictator. Fidel's strategy involved two major military campaigns: the Western Offensive, commanded by Che Guevara, which took action in Camagüey, Las Villas, Matanzas, and Havana, and the Eastern Attack, commanded by his brother Raúl Castro, concentrated on Mayari, Guantanamo, San Luis, and Santiago de Cuba. But for Castro, there was one element that could derail his entire revolution. Before he launched the offensive, he had to make sure he had the support from the majority of the Cuban people.
If you can't win the hearts and minds of the people in the land that you're occupying, you're never going to win on the battlefield.
One of the things that's most notable about Fidel is his ability to really win public appeal.
Batista's army was so demoralized at that point that people defected in large numbers. The soldiers defected, the units melted away, some of them surrendered, some of them even went over to the revolutionary forces. And so on New Year's Eve, Batista and his closest cronies got on a plane and left the country.
Fidel successfully entered Santiago de Cuba, the capital of Cuba's southeast province, on January 1st, 1959. The Cuban Revolution had triumphed, and Castro assumed the reins of the country.
Fidel Castro was always very confident in his own abilities. And I think that comes in part from having won a revolution, having triumphed over extraordinary odds to actually succeed in coming to power, and then to actually survive in the face of decades of hostility on the part of the United States.
Fidel Castro went on to become the longest-serving political leader of the 20th century, remaining at the helm of the Cuban government for 57 years. In 2006, he had left the island's power in the hands of his brother Raúl, and 10 years later, at the age of 90, he died on November 26, 2016. During World War II, in what is now Serbia, another revolutionary would successfully organize a guerrilla war that would lead him to the presidency of his country. A man whom everyone knew as Tito. At the time of the Second World War, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, consisting of what is now Slovenia, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, Croatia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina, is a monarchy under the rule of Prince Paul. By 1941, Hitler's troops occupy a large part of Europe and are preparing to carry out an invasion of Greece.
Yugoslavia was neutral when the Second World War began. But in the end, Hitler needed Yugoslav access in order to be able to invade Greece. And so the Prince Regent then signed a deal with Hitler.
The public weren't happy with the decision, and demonstrators gathered on the streets of Yugoslav's capital, Belgrade, shouting, "Better the grave than a slave, better a war than the pact." 2 days later, a group of Yugoslav Royal Air Force officers seized control of the government in a military coup.
And the prince was overthrown, and there was a provisional government put in power.
Hitler, angered by the coup, ordered that Yugoslavia be crushed without delay. The bombing of Belgrade began on April the 6th, 1941, unleashing an offensive so brutal that 11 days later, the Yugoslav army surrenders and the Axis forces divide Yugoslavia. One Yugoslav sees an opportunity amongst the chaos. A leader who would command the Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia until his death. Josip Broz, better known as Tito. Josip Broz was born northwest of Zagreb on May 7, 1892, into a large peasant family with a Croatian father and a Slovenian mother. But he had to abandon his studies to start work and help support his family.
As a poor boy growing up in rural surroundings, one of the draws he had was to shiny uniforms and good dress. He remembers one of his distant family members arriving in military uniform and all the young kids being mesmerized by it.
Tito did military service in a Croatian regiment of the Austro-Hungarian army and participated in the First World War as a sergeant.
He was wounded and captured by the Russians on the Russian front and would then spend several years in Russia.
And while he was a prisoner, he became convinced of the Marxist-Leninist revolutionary cause and came back to Yugoslavia as a communist revolutionary, bent on bringing communism to Yugoslavia.
After his return to Yugoslavia in 1920, Tito joined the newly founded Communist Party of Yugoslavia, or CPY, which the monarchy declared illegal the next year. But jail and repression did not intimidate the revolutionary, who assumed the name Tito in order to hide his identity and persevere with his underground party work. When war broke out in Yugoslavia in 1941, Tito was already the General Secretary of the Communist Party, and after more than 20 years in hiding, the Communists had become extremely well organized. On June the 22nd, 1941, when the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union began, Tito called on the Yugoslav people to unite against the Axis forces. An incredible task, as although Yugoslavia was one country, it was made up of different republics with differing ethnicities, ideologies, and beliefs. Nevertheless, the response was overwhelming, and in only 5 days, the National Liberation Partisan Detachments of Yugoslavia, better known as the Partisans, was created under Tito's command. Tito went to Bosnia and organized the partisans into units to start an effective guerrilla warfare throughout Yugoslavia.
They used very successful guerrilla strategies. They went up to the mountains, and they went to places where the Germans couldn't find them. They would do hit-and-run raids, and they specialized in that.
The advantage that they had was that the German occupation force was not big enough to garrison the whole country. So they garrisoned the towns and the cities, but the rural areas were largely left to their own devices. And since Yugoslavia is in many parts a very mountainous and heavily wooded country, provided a lot of opportunity to the partisans to hide and to strike into the towns and cities when they chose.
Tito chose tactics which in many ways were similar to those of Mao. What he wanted to create was a mobile army that could go from one side of the country to the other and fight across Yugoslavia.
However, Tito's guerrilla campaign, which had started as a slight irritation to the occupying forces, was now becoming a serious problem. And in January 1943, the Axis forces started an operation to encircle the partisans. It looked like his luck was beginning to run out.
Germans launched an attack on the highlands in Bosnia and Croatia. It was a massive surprise attack on areas controlled by the partisans, which included Wehrmacht and SS troops, as well as Italian troops. And this was an aim to use overwhelming force to destroy and crush the partisans.
However, to avoid defeat, Tito retreated into the mountain ranges of Yugoslavia with his guerrilla army.
Tito gave orders and sent out runners, emphasizing that they must not try to hold ground, that they must melt away, they must give up ground, and they must reappear where least expected and attack the enemy's rear areas, communication lines, headquarters, and so on. And this was effective. The Germans didn't have a target to punch at.
Between 1943 and 1944, the partisans made great advances. Tito had also called for further support from Stalin and the Soviet Red Army to help defeat the occupying Axis forces.
Somewhere in Yugoslavia, the famous partisans of Marshal Tito, who have staggered 19 fully equipped Nazi divisions.
The spring of 1944, Tito was in control of much of Yugoslav territory. Parts of Serbia were still under the control of Germany. Tito relied in part on the Red Army to liberate Belgrade in 1944. He had come to an interstate agreement with Stalin that the Red Army would pass through Yugoslavia, liberate the country.
The Belgrade offensive began on September the 14th, 1944. The partisans entered from the south, accompanied by some units from the Soviet Red Army, who also attacked from the north, completely encircling the capital. The conflict was fierce. After more than a month of heavy fighting, the last German stronghold retreated on October the 20th, ending the Nazi occupation of Yugoslavia.
Marshal Joseph Tito, head of the Yugoslav government and chief of the liberation armies, welcomes the Russians to the capital. Much more than an army's triumph, however, this is a people's triumph. A people who, during 4 years of German brutality and terror, did not sit idly by and wait. Like their comrades in arms, they fought back in every way they knew, even under the invaders' heel. For Balkan victory, the debt to Yugoslav guerrilla fighters is a great and lasting one. Russia and the world will not forget.
Tito would face a number of challenges in the early years after the war. The first one was keeping his country united.
Tito's priority at the end of the Second World War was to keep the country together. And this is where the partisan war was such an asset to him, because really it was three things at once. It was a war of national liberation, it was a communist revolution, and it was the building of a nation. All those three things at the same time.
On November the 29th, 1945, the People's Federal Republic of Yugoslavia was proclaimed. Although Tito led his communist government similar to the Russian system, his other great challenge was to keep the newly formed United Socialist Soviet Republic, the USSR, at arm's length. This caused tension between Tito and Stalin, and it's believed the Soviet leader tried on a number of occasions to have Tito assassinated.
Tito's independence and foreign policy initiatives, which Stalin did not like, presented in many ways a challenge to Stalin's authority. So there was, in the middle of 1948, an open split between Yugoslavia and the rest of the Soviet bloc.
Marshal Tito would remain in power for 35 years.
When Tito died in 1980, his funeral resembled a major international gathering of the United Nations, where a large number of heads of state gathered, including Queen Elizabeth, but also Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev.
Tito managed to lead the most successful European resistance movement of World War II. Moreover, he was able to merge his political ideals with the unification of a nation plagued by multi-ethnic conflicts. With his military strategy, he ensured the future of a communist country independent of Moscow's grasp.
Tito's legacy as a military leader, as a guerrilla leader, is assured. He conducted a very effective guerrilla war against the Nazis, which was successful, and in orthodox communist fashion, that combined a revolution with an insurgency and resulted in a communist Yugoslavia. So on that basis, he could hardly have been more successful.
In Southeast Asia, another country was also struggling to unify its territory under one single communist government. Besieged by great superpowers, first the French and then the Americans, after decades of armed clashes, Vietnam finally managed to unify thanks to the strategy of a man who never had any formal military training, Nguyen Giap. By 1926, composed of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, Indochina is a French colony.
For decades, especially in the 20th century with the rise of nationalism around the time of World War I, you had Indochinese, as they were called, increasingly asserting rights relative to the French. And the Indochinese communists, who gained inspiration and some financial support from the communists based in the Soviet Union, increasingly tried to lead this nationalist resistance.
The communists were led by a former schoolmaster, Ho Chi Minh. They defied French authority, and in 1939, the Communist Party of Indochina, or ICP, was declared illegal. Brutally oppressed, and from fear of being assassinated, many of its militants went into exile. Nguyen Giap had attended the same high school as Ho Chi Minh, and from then on was committed to the communist cause. When the French began their brutal persecution of the Vietnamese militants, Giap managed to escape to China. But his wife and sister-in-law were captured by the authorities. His sister-in-law was executed by guillotine, and his wife died after 3 years in prison. Marked for life, the revolution and Vietnam's independence would become a personal challenge for Giap, who would come to be seen as a hero by communists around the world, inspired by a man who had defeated 2 great superpowers with a popular movement. Nguyen Giap was born into a peasant family in Quang Minh province in north-central Vietnam on August 25, 1911. His father passed his anti-colonialist sentiment onto his son from an early age. Giap also became enthralled by the work of T.E. Lawrence and Napoleon Bonaparte, whose work had a deep influence on his inspiration for military strategy.
Well, it should be said that Giap was influenced a lot by T. Lawrence, by Lawrence of Arabia. He used to say he carried around the 7 Pillars of Wisdom, which was Lawrence's famous book, in his knapsack.
In the late 1930s, inspired by Ho Chi Minh, Giap joined the ICP, and by 1937, after graduating in law in Hanoi, began teaching history in high school. A year later, he married Minh Thai, also a communist militant. Giap's wife would die in a French imperial prison in the early 1940s, while he was exiled in China due to the French persecution of communists. In 1939, World War II broke out, and it would have a profound effect on Indochina.
First, you had the German defeat of the French, which weakened France's hold on French Indochina. The Japanese, as a member of the Axis with Germany and Italy, came in to assert privileges in terms of resources they needed from Indochina, and then in March 1945, directly took over rule of French Indochina from the French.
Giap returned to Vietnam and joined the League for the Independence of Vietnam, or Viet Minh, founded by Ho Chi Minh in 1941 with the support of Vietnamese nationalist groups also fighting for their country's independence. After its devastating defeat in World War II, the Japanese left Vietnam in August 1945.
Ho Chi Minh, aided by Nguyen Giap, his military commander, rushed to Hanoi and declared the independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam.
However, after the Second World War, France reclaimed control of Indochina.
On December 19th, 1946, the First Indochina War broke out. For 8 years, the French tried unsuccessfully to put an end to the Viet Minh, led by Giap and Ho Chi Minh. The guerrilla warfare the group was pursuing was putting up a strong resistance.
The French were stronger in the south than they were in the north. They tried to use local forces to do the fight, but they didn't have quite the same loyalty.
Over the course of the war, the Viet Minh grew stronger, gained widespread popular support, and achieved significant victories under the orders of its commander-in-chief, General Giap. Giap had other advantages. He could speak some of the languages of ethnic minority groups of Indochina and understood the cultures and customs of different people, which made it easier to persuade them to join the revolutionary forces.
He, for the most part, used guerrilla warfare. The French might control the cities or the towns or checkpoints in the daytime, but at night, the countryside would belong to the guerrillas.
By the end of 1953, the French were losing more and more territory. They decided to concentrate their forces in Dien Bien Phu, a city near the border with Laos.
And the French were desperate to tempt Giap out of guerrilla warfare and organized the French garrison at Dien Bien Phu in northern Vietnam. And Giap decided to play the French's game and surrounded Dien Bien Phu, and that led to the siege of Dien Bien Phu.
Giap shifted his strategy from quick fight, quick victory to steady fight and advance, and managed to lock the French in their own base. There was no way in or out. The French could not even access their own supplies.
Dien Bien Phu was intended to support offensive operations, but also potentially entice the communists to attack on the assumption that they wouldn't be able to overrun it. And this depended largely on the assumption that French artillery was going to be stronger than communist artillery. Indeed, they didn't expect communist artillery at all.
But to the surprise of the French, Giap arrived with heavy weaponry, which had been provided by the Chinese.
The Indo-Chinese guerrillas haul massive amounts of artillery through dense jungle and set up against Dien Bien Phu and lay siege to what the French thought was going to be an impregnable position.
This confrontation went on for weeks. It was incredibly dramatic. There were attempts to airlift supplies to the forces, but increasingly Giap's forces closed in, and the result was that Giap's forces were able to take over Dien Bien Phu, and that basically shut the door on French colonialism.
With the victory at Dien Bien Phu, Giap had defeated the first great power he'd come up against.
It's a historic battle that demonstrated his military prowess.
The French defeat in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu was sealed on May 7, 1954. The following day, talks on Indochina began at the Geneva Conference in Switzerland. There, the independence of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam was agreed upon. But given the ideological differences, Vietnam was split in two: the communist in the north and an American-backed government in the south.
By July 1956, there were supposed to be elections to nationalize, to unify Vietnam under one government. However, with U.S. support, The southern part of the country refused to take part in the elections. And of course, this all laid the groundwork for what would become, to Americans, the Vietnam War, and to the Vietnamese, the American War, or the Second Indochinese War.
In North Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh headed the communist government, and Giap took over as commander-in-chief of the Vietnam People's Army. Tensions between North and South increased. However, with support from Giap's forces in the north, communist supporters in the south formed a resistance group called the National Liberation Front, widely known as the Viet Cong.
It took a while before the communists organized themselves in the south, but gradually a guerrilla campaign began. And in the early 60s, it was starting to get quite serious.
On March the 8th, 1965, US President Lyndon Johnson decided to become more actively involved in the conflict between North and South Vietnam. He began sending US troops into the country.
Over many years, we have made a national pledge to help South Vietnam defend its independence, and I intend to keep that promise.
The North Vietnamese, although outgunned in terms of military technology, turned out to be incredibly effective at fighting non-traditional guerrilla warfare battles, and also to be shockingly willing to take massive casualties, because the US dropped more bombs on North Vietnam and on communist-controlled territories of South Vietnam and Laos, far more than all the bombs dropped on all the countries in World War II, and yet the fight went on, the stalemate went on.
By 1968, the Americans had more than 500,000 troops in Vietnam. However, they were never able to defeat the communists. Giap's strategies had proved to be highly effective.
He was pragmatic enough to recognize that in certain situations, the US had an advantage, and therefore he preferred to rely on guerrilla attacks, ambushes, using intelligence effectively. Giap was ready to wage warfare where the idea was to create mystery, suspicion, paranoia on the part of the American forces where they wouldn't even know where the enemy was.
After more than 5 years of active US involvement in Vietnam, the idea that the war could not be won began to take hold in the White House. On January the 27th, 1973, in Paris, peace agreements were signed. South Vietnam, now without American support, failed to contain the communists. Ho Chi Minh's forces took Saigon in 1975, and a year later, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, reunifying the country, was proclaimed. Vo Nguyen Giap, nicknamed the Red Napoleon, was a military genius who masterfully developed both guerrilla warfare and more conventional war strategies. Through meticulous organization and logistical planning, Giap had successfully defeated 2 major superpowers.
His success against the French, which was apparent by 1954, really inspired other anti-colonial movements and uprisings to believe that it was not hopeless to fight the Europeans.
Giap was an extremely successful general, and he's normally credited with taking the sort of people's army of the Vietnamese communists and turning it into quite a formidable force.
Mao, Tito, Fidel, and Giap had all faced down armies more powerful than their own.
You can compare it to a heavyweight boxer against a lightweight. The heavyweight boxer can punch these big blows, but that's only effective if they can hit the lightweight, whereas the lightweight can keep running round the wing and taking these smaller shots, hitting every single time. And in the end, they'll be effective. And that's what guerrillas do. They can sustain it for longer, and that's how they overcome their enemy.
Against the odds, Mao, Tito, Fidel, and Giap managed to emerge victorious and create legacies that have lived and continue to live long after their deaths. Immortalized as communist icons, they have also earned their place in the history of warfare as military masterminds.